travel the banks of the Asian River Nile. The conception of religion, I gave it to the world. The ancient gods, Ra, Amun, Osiris, Horus, Isis. I traveled. I built the pyramids, my temples, my places of eye learning. I built the African mysticism. I traveled Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, empires, rulers of the planet Earth. I traveled India. I gave Buddhism, China, Mongolia. I traveled in Greece. It was who gave the teachings to Plato, Socrates, Homer, Herodotus. I traveled Rome. It was who built the first university of Europe in Spain. The Rock of Gibraltar was named after one of my generals, General Tariq Gibran. I traveled Sudan, Nubia, Axum, Kush, Nigeria, Ghana. I was taken by slave traders. Chains around my ankle and my feet. I suffered in silence, longing to be free. I was taken to the slave plantation of the Western world. I worked. My woman taken away. My children sold as a commodity. I traveled the Caribbean islands. I witnessed the slave plantations filled with my people. I traveled Europe, the European continent, and lo and behold, walking in the streets of London, I saw people, strange people. They looked like Africans, like Egyptians, Ethiopians, and yet their name was Smith, James, Brown. Who are they? What manner of people are you? You who come through the vine of the imperial house of Egypt, Ethiopia, who gave civilization to the world. Look at you now. You are being called mothers. You are being called druggies. You are being called all type of names. Lamentation. 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 of kings was crowned in Africa. At the League of Nations,
Tender and Wali, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kudzai, Mudzimu Mokodo, we give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation for all African people. Greetings, brothers and sisters, to a special screening on this Ojama Day, Wednesday, the 5th of June, brothers and sisters. It is now 12 minutes past the hour of 7 p.m. if you are on UK time, British summertime, right about now, kings and queens. And we are here with an extra special session looking at the problems and prospects of African unity with our elder Cecil Gutzmore. The voice that you have just been listening to is one Ras Cosmo Ben Imhotep, also known, brothers and sisters, as Baba Herukuti, who left to join the ancestors, if my maths are not mistaken, on the 16th of the month called May, brothers and sisters, just a couple weeks ago. And so the Pan-African community, the Rastafari community in particular, in the UK and worldwide, has been, honoring his name and celebrating his life. And that was held for him on the 25th of May, which is Africa Liberation Day, which is most appropriate if you understand and know the man that Baba Herukuti Ras Cosmo Ben Imhotep was. And so it was appropriate, brothers and sisters, to just begin the show, honoring our Baba and his group, who was a musician and was a prominent member of a group called the Ras Messengers. And I have a lot to, honor the Ras Messengers for, because I was raised upon one of the greatest and most influential bodies of musical work in my time, which was Songs of the Motherland, brothers and sisters, by a man who was then known as Anom Iyapo, and today is known as Ankh Anum, Ankanum. And I'm spelling out the name because that album, Songs of the Motherland by Ankh Anum, was recently re-released by his son, who goes by the name of Shabaka Hutchins, brothers and sisters, a great jazz musician in today's world, and the son of Ankh Anum. And that album was recently re-released, so you can check that out on all your streaming platforms, and you can even get the vinyl and all them things they write about now, brothers and sisters. But the album, the music for that album, was much of it was composed and performed by Ras Cosmo Ben Imhotep, Baba Herukuti, and the Ras Messengers, brothers and sisters. And so we're just honoring, the recent ancestors as we begin our show today. And without further ado, let me introduce you to long-standing scholar, activist, warrior scholar in our global African community, brothers and sisters, the man who you've come to listen to today. Let me introduce you to Brother Elder Cecil Gutzmore. Tendam Wari, greetings, Elder Cecil.
Greetings to you, my brother. It's an honor to be with you. I watched you grow up on that music and in that 1970s, 80s moment. So always good to see you and to be with you, and hopefully our millions of viewers.
Yes, Baba. Yes, Baba. It's always good to hear to be here with you, and our viewers always appreciate when you come through, Elder Cecil. So we give thanks for your willingness to do so, and for the topic that you've chosen today for us. Just a quick word, Elder Cecil, because I began with the Ras Messengers, and I don't know, like you were around at the time, yeah. So what was the energies? Yeah, what can you tell us? Just give us an insight into that energy surrounding Ras Cosmo Ben Israel, who, by the way, is the prominent Rastaman that features in the film Babylon. Yeah, for those who have seen the film Babylon, he's in the film Babylon, and he's the Ras that hands the chalice to the main character.
I must remind myself by having a second or 10th look at that film for that purpose.
Yes. But go ahead.
You had as the I don't know, screenshot.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the word? The wallpaper.
Yes, sir. Yes.
The what looked to me like the 1977 Africa Liberation Day in Birmingham.
Yes, you're correct.
Look at that film. That, in a way, or that photo, shows the power of that moment and the hold that Rastafari had taken in the UK of our youth. Because in Babylon, it's a particularly wicked moment. The white working class wielders of violence had discovered that the safe place for them to be was in the police force. And in that institution, they were able to do anything they wanted to black people, and did do anything they wanted to black people. And as our young people discovered, rediscovered their African heritage, discovered a particular way into it through Rastafari music, Birmingham particularly, but the whole of Black UK. And it didn't matter where they came from. You could from Trinidad or Jamaica, from Ghana or Nigeria or Jamaica. That in that moment, it was the language and the power of Rastafari, informed incidentally by the power of the Old Testament, that same King James Version book, which really turned Rastafari on to an extraordinarily powerful language on top of what they got out of Jamaican patois, out of Jamaican, if you will. So it was an extraordinary moment, and we've in a way come down from it, because what happened in Birmingham particularly was that the police turned on the youth in that Rastafari guise, and were extraordinarily wicked to them in terms of the pressures they put, and so it drove a lot of our young people out of that perspective, if you will, and so we're no longer there. But I think the residue is kind of can't be erased, unerasable, and so yes, and our brother who has passed, Ras Harakuti, was a key part of that moment. I picked up my my iPod today and was looking back through it, and there was Ras messengers who had actually forgotten were there, and of course Ras Anum, who you mentioned, was an extraordinarily powerful poetic voice. In that moment, in all of those ALDs, starting in Nottingham in 1975. Incidentally, next year will be the 50th anniversary, and my sincere hope is that we will go back to Nottingham for the 50th anniversary, and if there are any rifts in PACM or wherever, we have to bury those hatchets, not in each other, but in, but in the sand. And, and get on with putting the forces back together to
absolutely,
because there were some extraordinary figures in Nottingham at that time who we also want to remember. And I'm proposing that next year, a key figure in what inspired the PACM in the UK was a brother called Ron Phillips, who passed after going back to Guyana and then going to the United States, where he was, I think, teaching when he passed. And we need to just remember him in 2025, because he was a key figure in that delegation to the Six Pack, and a key figure in what became the PACM, and also incidentally a key figure for an extended moment in organizing Festac, who's actually appointed by the Nigerian government and was for a while their organizer of Festac in the UK.
Oh, so at some point we're gonna have to do something on the Pan-African history of the UK, because it's a little known story, and there are a few people better equipped to tell it than yourself.
Let's do it. Let's do it on one of these. Shall we call them monthly events here?
Even that, or I may have one other suggestion. So stay tuned. I'll put that to you another time. All right.
I promise you not to do it. I promise not to go away.
No, that's good. give thanks. All right. But Elder Cecil, it's your time, so I'm gonna hand over to you to present for as long as you wish to. And then I'll come back and we'll engage afterwards. Before I do so, let me just shout out the people who are listening, locked in, locked on. Please like up the video as you come through, and raise the algorithmic presence of our session today. And I want to ask you all to share the video as well, far and wide. People don't know it's Shakara is live with Elder Cecil right about now, discussing the problems and prospects of African unity. Big up Wise the Dome in the building, my brother Rakeem Shabazz. Feel free, please, brothers and sisters, to subscribe to Wise the Dome TV if you are not subscribed to Wise the Dome TV. Unlugani, big up yourself. Thank you for joining us, and Guy Destin and all the other silent viewers and listeners. Elder Cecil, over to you.
Thank you, my young brother, and let's hope that we will have an informative exchange. I expect not just to be speaking, but to get insightful questions and comments back in due course. Now, you're right that my topic is problems and prospects of African unity. And it's clearly a big topic, and it's big not least because of, let us start with the size of Africa. And anybody who looks at the map of Africa, in part because of what European geographers did to it, quite easily fail to understand Africa's size. Unfortunately, there's a map somewhere which shows how many other places in the world, so China, the USA, India, much of Western Europe, including the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and so on, can fit on the map of Africa and still have a lot of land area left over. It is gigantic. And so it would be an extraordinary achievement were it to be united now, just because of the brute size. But it is important that one of the reasons and one of the facts and problems of the absence of African unity is the fact that at no time, that is very much the map, and I hope our viewers are seeing it, and you will see that United States of America, France, China, India, and so on, and many other places are on it. So that is the point. And it really would be extraordinary were it united now. And it matters that even though it has cultural unity going for it, and that is despite the linguistic diversity, despite the geographical diversity, it is proper and legitimate and accurate to speak of there being something called African cultural unity, which important scholars of our recent past have explored informatively. So unlike China, unlike India, Africa has never been one juridical entity, and that matters. So let us look at the other places where unity is a feature, national unity. And it's sensible, actually, to divide those unified places, some of which are relatively large, India, China, for example, United States of America, to divide them into perhaps older juridical entities, older states, and younger United States. And let us talk about the problems of them being what they are in terms of being united. So if you go and look at China, we know that in fact it's not united strictly because in the 19th century, Europe took away parts of it. And in the 20th century, after a civil war, China ended up with mainland China with Hong Kong that was still under British rule. The British left humiliatingly some time ago. And after the Civil War, some islands off the coast of Africa, off the coast of China, represented the location to which the defeated backward pro-imperialist forces of China retreated. And for a long time, the West said that the government on those islands represented China and gave them the UN Security Council seat for decades before the West came to its senses and said that really clearly Chairman Mao's China and the Communist Republic of China clearly is China, and those islands cannot be in international terms regarded as being China. And the Western forces that did that are now busy arming those islands and saying that China is not entitled to be reunited, and arming them in that it is in that context that they gave Australia nuclear weapons. And so, but what's important about China, in addition to the way it was both united and disunited in the 20th century by a revolution led by the Communist Party of China and particularly by Chairman Mao, historically, it's an old entity. And if you go and look at the history of China, you will find that all of the stuff we know about the Great War, about this and that and the other dynasty, is the history of a place that was once forcibly unified. And that wall, that famous Great Wall of China, is one of the monuments to the attempt to preserve that united geographical and juridical entity from external forces. So China is an old united state. And the same applies to India, where somebody called Asoka, every Indian, educated, half educated, knows about the fact that millennia ago, there were forces in India that assembled out of what we call ancient Hindustan, one juridical entity. And to some extent, it was united also by an ideological setup called Hinduism, which got partly replaced from inside itself by the Buddhism, and also got partly replaced and displaced by Islam, which came in militantly over time and ended up converting a big part of the Indian population. And then India was, of course, divided into East Pakistan and West Pakistan. There's a war between East and West Pakistan. East Pakistan became Bangladesh, and so on. But there is violence in the unification of that entity. And there are still issues there now about the disunity, because the current Indian government, in fact, like all previous Indian governments, didn't want to give back a part of what is really Pakistan, namely Kashmir, to Pakistan, where it properly belongs because of the Muslim nature of that population. So those are two very old states, and violence and power are major factors that made it possible for them to be united juridical entities. And that, in part, is what is called upon and mobilized when we hear talk about a united India or united China. Now, the United States of America is another big one. And everybody will know or remember that its unity is the result of Euro-Christian, Judeo-Christian barbarism directed against the original inhabitants of that territory. They now sing about America as the shining city on the hill, and they speak about from sea to shining sea. But there were people in between those two seas, and those people and the animals and other creations that were in the way had to be eliminated in order for white power in all its brutality to become the illegitimate inheritors, possessors that didn't inherit it. They took it by force from the original population, and that after a civil war, which was about another key aspect of the sociocultural history of the United States of America, that civil war was fought over slavery, the right of the states in the South to extend enslavement of Africans westwards and to hold on to enslaved Africans in the southern states. That's what that war was about. Now, it's as well that we remember that Abraham Lincoln, who is praised for running that war to a successful conclusion, didn't care, as we say in Jamaica, more than so about the enslaved. What he cared about was the Union. And he's on record. We have the quote where he says that he would settle for the Union unfree, partly free, and enslaved as long as the Union was preserved. And in fact, at the start of that Civil War, the northern states offered the southern states a settlement which enabled them to keep their enslaved and even to expand the terrain of slavery. And the enslavers in the southern states actually refused that compromise. So there are two versions of something I think is called the 13th Amendment. If you go and look, you'll see that the first version, which was rejected by the South, is this document in which the United States of America offered the enslaving states the right to remain in the Union on the basis of keeping their enslaved in slavery. Yeah, so that's the United States of America. It is there and united because the pro-freedom side, which at fundament really wasn't pro-freedom, but the insistence that we must maintain this Union side, won the Civil War. Now, we have so much more. We're in a complicated world. So we know that there's a place called the United Kingdom. There's a place called France. There's a place called Italy. They're very tiny in comparison to Africa, and we have to remember that. But they are united kingdoms. And if you go and look at their history, you will see that their unity is based on the deployment of state force by an elite, by a ruling class. So in Britain, you can see Wales being conquered, you can see Scotland being conquered, and you can see above all Ireland being conquered over the period from about the 1200s right through to we're now close to the end of that process. Irish people had to fight for their united state, and in the 1920s they had one stage of success which led to the Republic of Ireland, and then the northern states, which was truncated. There were actually 9 counties. The British allowed 3 to go in order to hold on to the Protestant-dominated remaining 6 counties. And since the 1970s, really the late 1960s, the Northern Irish Republicans, who were mainly Catholic, fought against what was really an incredibly oppressive. You think of Britain as a democratic state. There was no democracy in the 6 counties of the north of Ireland. It was a brutal tyranny of the Protestant over the Irish nationalist community, of the Protestants over the Catholic community, which was also broadly Republican and Irish Republican in nature. Those Republican forces fought the British militarily and won. And when we get told about the wonders of the Good Friday Agreement, please remember that the Good Friday Agreement rests on the defeat of the British state. And inside of it, that is conceded, because following that defeat, the British have agreed that once the demography allows, and it's happening before our very eyes, once the demography allows, the people of the north of Ireland can vote, and the British won't be able to stop them joining the Republic of Ireland as one state. It's about to happen. It may take another 20 years, but within the British Constitution, as constituted, if you will, by the Good Friday Agreement, is that Britain has conceded that a part of itself, illegitimately taken over centuries and terribly illegitimately consolidated in the 20th century, goes back to the Ireland which they took by force. And most people don't know this, but let me tell you, the brutality with which British, as in English and Scottish ruling class people, took Ireland needs to be remembered. Oliver Cromwell was part of that. And Cromwell boasted about putting the population of 2 Irish towns, Drogheda and Wexford, to the sword in the name of the Lord. That means he killed all of the Catholic population of those 2 towns. That's how European Protestantism operated in those days when religion was at the center of their civil wars. Now, much more recently than that, we've had United Germany, United Italy, and after a fashion, United Europe. United Europe harks back to something called the Holy Roman Empire. And it's kind of mythical, but also symbolic. The Roman Catholic Church was there. Evil and self-deceiving, corrupt, and so on. So a reformation happened, and that to some extent certainly broke it up theologically, and it also helped to break up Europe from a kind of Europe-wide Catholic state unity into the series of nation states that still inhabit Europe. So we have Holland becoming an independent state. We have France being forced into being one state. There's a time, for example, when Britain owned parts of what is now France, and when there were wars between them, an English queen died saying words to the effect that Calais, part of France, physically will be on their heart. Now, let's look, for example, and it matters, at Germany. Everybody knows how rich and powerful Germany is. At the end of the 18th century, Germany did not exist in anything like its present shape. There were a series of German-speaking political entities in Europe. The biggest of them was Austria. The most powerful of them was a place called Prussia, which had a wonderful army and a very clear sense of military organization. And if you look at how Germany became the German Empire by the time of Bismarck, you have to look at that, and you'll see that something called the Zollverein, which is an economic thing, and then after that, a series of economic stroke military and even ideological processes and structures were put into place, which ended up with Germany being the gigantic united entity that it was by the time of Bismarck. Wars were fought to unite Germany. And then the last of that unifying process actually took place in 1938, when under Hitler, Austria joined the rest of Germany. And it's a process, I think it was called the Anschluss or something of that sort. My German isn't very good. And so Hitler completed the process of uniting Germany. A similar thing happened in Italy, which we won't bother to go into. So importantly, all of the states in the modern world, the big ones, but they don't have to be big, started off disunited, and their unity has been achieved usually and more often than not via violence. In the case of the European Union, which is now 20-odd states inside of this peculiar entity, which may or may not survive. We've seen that Britain has left and that there are similar forces in other parts of Western Europe that are pressing one way or another to exit the European Union. It was assembled in the aftermath of the war. The French and Germans knew that they couldn't have yet another war in which millions died over effectively nothing. And so they are the base, along with 5 or 6 other European countries. Britain refused to join at that time when the Treaty of Rome was signed, bringing into being the European Economic Community, which is the economic base, French agriculture, German industry that represented the putting together of what is now the European Union. So even though violence was not the driver, as in the case of the unification of Germany, or the unification of Italy, or the unification of the United States of America, it is still the case that it was the violence of the First and Second World War, really European civil wars, that drove Western Europeans away from their internecine warfare and towards the notion that they really had to make one Europe out of the multiple countries that were present in continental Europe. And the most insightful of them, General de Gaulle, who was insightful enough to know that France couldn't hold on to Algeria. So he wasn't all bad. And he used to talk, not all that without sense, about Europe potentially and ideally stretching from the Atlantic, including Britain, to the Urals, so in taking in part of Russia, which was then the Soviet Union. I say all of this to remind ourselves that unity, national unity, even in smallish places, incomparably smaller than our continental homeland, Africa, has always had violence or the threat of violence as the main driver for the entities in question coming together. And that applies to old India and China, and it applies to oldish Great Britain and oldish France, and it applies to much newer United States of America and much newer Germany, and so on. So none of those resources of force were in fact available to our continental homeland. And that, when we think about it, is one of the big problems of the absence of African unity. There was no entity on the continent of a political and military and ideological size and orientation able to make Africa into one juridical entity, despite the relatively common culture made available. So then let us look at the history of our continent. And let us bear in mind that when we talk about African unity, we have not just to be talking about the continent or even the islands that are now included when we say 56 states, but also the Western diaspora, places like the Caribbean, where there are territories after territories that have a gigantic African majority that are not in fact African states, but could be. And because we have numerical majority there in all of those places, places like Jamaica, places like Barbados, are conceivable as African states joining a properly organized and properly thought through entity that would be a United States of Africa. So we're not just talking when we say that there are problems of African disunion and how we assess and construct the prospects of unity, so that we're not just talking about the geographical continent, we're also talking about a diaspora which has possibilities in repeated places of turning up as states, African states, because of majority African populations ready to be part of global Africa. Now, let us concentrate on our continental homeland. I said repeatedly that it is unfortunately true that unlike much smaller India and much smaller China, continental Africa has never been one juridical entity. And it doesn't matter how the historians search, and some have, you will not find a time when one government ruled over our continental homeland. There have been gigantic empires showing that Africans can organize and run them and keep them together for centuries, as did the Europeans and the Indians and the Chinese. But none of those empires, whether you're talking about Great Zimbabwe or much further west in Ghana, which takes you back into the 300 of the Common Era, or Songhai much later, or Mali in between, gigantic empires, incredibly rich. Anybody who listens to the History Man knows, and he's not the only one to say it, and there's good evidence that the ruler of one of those empires was by far the richest man, just counted in terms of gold possessed, quantum of gold possessed, the richest man that history has ever seen. Some present day billionaires may be contesting that. I don't know, but if it's based on gold, it's certainly the case that there's a truth in there. So no previous united African state upon which Africans could call for inspiration in the way that Indians can call for inspiration in their united past, or Chinese can call for inspiration from their united past and virtual current national unity. So what, in terms of negative input from outside, have represented forces standing in the pathway of continental African unity? Of course, let me register again that one of the things that has happened is that millions of our ancestors, including my more or less immediate ancestors of the last few hundred years, were taken out of Africa by a process of trickery and violence into so-called Atlantic enslavement, and that something more or less similar happened with regard to the transfer of our people like me, from Africa south of the Sahara into countries to the north, to the northern part of Africa, across the Sahara and across the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean into Arabia and into Mesopotamia and so on. Those have been divisive forces, and the effects of that have to be reversed as part of the notion of the construction of a united global Africa. But let's keep our focus on our continental homeland, motherland. Everybody knows that the greatest and most humanity civilizing geopolitical and cultural entity, ancient Egypt, Kemet, was African, and that everything that we now consider to be the elements of human civilization, urbanization, well-watered, well-fed towns, temples, pyramids, architecture, therefore, advanced science, medicine of an incredibly detailed and competent time. I'm in the process of getting back from Jamaica a book of mine called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, which speaks to surgical practice, not the start of surgical practice, but a moment in surgical practice within ancient Kemet. Somebody correctly says that if you're saying Kemet, you don't have to put ancient in there. Ancient Egypt, Kemet. Wonderful knowledge in all spheres. Some of it still unsurpassed, a lot of it lost, destroyed by a combined process of the Greeks pulling it together out of the temples into a single library or two, and then burning it down, dispersing it, hiding it, etc., over a period from really just after the birth of Christ through the next 8 or so centuries, when phase after phase of destruction, fire, deliberate and accidental, destroyed what could have been as many as 800,000 books in one of the libraries that we're talking about. Now, the fact that that empire, Kemet, was conquered signifies a big truth about the presence or potentiality, not just of our continent, but on our continental homeland, of destructive, disunifying forces. So we cannot speak of the conquest of Kemet by Alexander the Great without knowing that we're talking about the decay of the protective power of continental Africa in the defeat or reduction of entities like Kemet, and round about the same time or a little bit later, Carthage, which was a northern African empire, which ended up being defeated by the Romans. Now, that military nakedness in the north of our continent, somebody called it the fall of black power, and I salute the brother who came up with that notion in an article in my time in Jamaica. The weakness, military weakness, is emphasized by the arrival a few centuries later, in the 7th century, in our continental homeland, of forces that were by no means all white, but we're talking about the forces of Islam, the Muslim forces that in the late-ish 600s, not all that late, mid-600s of the Common Era, what used to be called AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. We don't bother with that again, and we say the Common Era just because the whole world has come in a way to have imposed on it, I was about to say accept, but the Muslims have never gone down that road. They start time from their prophet. But in short, shortly after the establishment of Islam as a religion, that religion and the forces that expanded with it, expanded by a combination of ideas and, more importantly, military force, and effectively captured first Kemet. That conquest was complicated because the Kemetians at the time were not all that keen on the then rulers, and so Islam represented an alternative helpful force in exactly the way that later on in our history Africans sided long-term foolishly with one European conquering state against another, and everybody lost out in the process while the Europeans gained. We may come back to that. So importantly, by the 700s of the Common Era, the north of Africa is no longer in African hands. And within another few centuries, by the 1400s, our continent is threatened in fundamental ways, not immediately visibly so, but emphatically so, by military and naval developments in Europe. There's a book about guns and trade, guns and sail in the early Middle Ages, and what that been revised a little bit since, but basically a correct idea that Europe had military technology and the sailing technology to go forth into the world, discover beautiful people, and enslave and kill them and take their land and their possessions. This is the age of so-called discovery. There were no lost people in the world, so it wasn't an age of discovery. It was an age of conquest, of piracy, of genocide, and so on. And you can look at the genocides. The first one, as the Europeans begin to expand out of Europe, it really starts in the 1200s when the Iberians go to the nearest African islands, the Azores and the Azores and so on, that set of islands there, and conquer and kill off the people. And then they do the same thing, Columbus across the Atlantic, 1492, and incredibly rich civilization, and I mean it literally, rich in gold, rich in everything, with a theology and a cosmogony, a worldview that was incredibly richer than the people who were conquering them. The only point of superiority that Christopher Columbus had was guns and war dogs and horses and blunderbusses and cannon. There's a big point of superiority, but that superiority ended up effectively eliminating the natives of, first of all, the Northern Caribbean, the Big Islands, Greater Antilles, and then slowly the French and the British and the Dutch joined in and effectively killed off, not totally, but almost, the other peoples of the Caribbean. And we're not talking about a few half-naked savages, my brothers and sisters. We're talking about millions of people. And we know that there were millions, not just because we know, but because the Spaniards counted. On Haiti, they counted when the population had been reduced by something like 2/3. The Spaniards counted 1,100,000 inhabitants on that island. On that island, the Spaniards themselves report that a part of Haiti called Zaragao had waterworks and aqueducts that were on the scale and ingenuity of the best that the Spaniards had left behind in Spain, what the Moors had built for them. So we're not, as us Jamaicans say, talking about any Pian people that they discovered, so-called, came across and murdered en masse in the Caribbean. We're actually talking about a significant part of humanity that humanity had lost a lot from the Europeans having eliminated. Back to our continental homeland. So from the start of the 1400s, Spain and Portugal are able to conquer northwestern part of the continent. Portugal goes down Africa's west coast, and eventually before 1500 actually gets round the southern coast and out into the Indian Ocean, where they again make discoveries, where they again engage in genocides, where they conquer and exploit and so on. Now, that process ended up imposing enslavement and the extraction of our people in at least 3 directions in gigantic numbers. That process also ended up with us being politically ruled by others. That's what colonialism was. So imperialism approached Africa and to a large extent the rest of the world. Us Africans have to remember that even though we were uniquely enslaved by the Europeans and the Arabs on a racist and racial basis, all of those people, including the Arabs and the Chinese and the Indians, were themselves set upon by the Euro-Christian, Judeo-Christian terrorists and conquered, colonized, etc. So the process of colonization is worldwide. And in Africa, it proceeds slowly. The Dutch go to Southern Africa and succeed there after a fashion because the climate suited them in a way that the climate in West Africa did not suit white people, and that climate kept them out of those territories for a considerable period of time. But by the time we get in towards the end of the 19th century, Africa is totally colonized. And to the extent that it's not totally colonized, what happens is that the Europeans say, we are now ready to colonize the whole of this place. Let us meet and talk about how we handle the parts of it that our armies have not yet claimed on behalf of European states. That's what the Congress of Berlin was about. Go and look at the records. You will see that key to the discussion is what happens to the Congo River Basin and what happens to the Niger River Basin. The Niger was kind of self-solving because the French and the British, and to some extent the Dutch, were already there, and the Danes, right? You go and look along the West African coast, you see residues of forts and factories and so on that were constructed by all of these smallish European countries, which with some kind of permission or treaty with local West African chief states, what have you. And importantly, Walter Rodney, in a little pamphlet called West Africa and the Atlantic Slave Trade, talks about the political ideological approach and indeed historical approach that we need to have when we of the diaspora are thinking about how it came to be and what were the processes by which some of our ancestors betrayed their responsibilities, if you will, to their fellow Africans and participated frequently under duress, but also frequently for compensation, if you will, in that process by which our ancestors were taken out. We have to understand that and take it into account. So, end of the 19th century, 1884-85, Congress of Berlin. What the Europeans decide is that a few European, Euro-Christian countries don't have any colonies, and they must be provided for. Belgium gets the Congo. Germany gets Southwest Africa and Tanzania and some other places. And it is agreed that our continental homeland will be divided up to suit these people and their wishes and desires, nothing to do with the existing demographics of our continent. So Hausa people are in about 3 different European designated and constructed political entities now, and the same applies to Yoruba and so on. So the Africa of now is the Africa that the Europeans in the late colonial moment decided should be the shape of Africa. Now, Africans, whether educated by the West or not, always resisted, and that is important. So our history of resistance has to be part of the story. And so anti-colonial thoughts, the obvious human need for us to be free, for us to be not ruled by people who don't look like us, for us to be ruled by people who aren't bringing anything and just taking. And when they appear to be bringing something, it is to enable them to take more or to organize us to help them in the taking. That's always the purpose of what appears to be anything that the devils that Muhammad Ali recognized when he was talking about snakes. So whenever they come, like the Greeks, to keep mixing a metaphor, bringing gifts, we Africans need to know that we have to have an analysis of what this gift is, because there is something like, mixing the metaphor, extending it, a deadly sting in the tail. So we, starting in the 19th century, when Africans, with or without European education, are thinking that this state of affairs is wrong and needs to end. African nationalism, anti-European, anti-colonialism, and even anti-imperialism begin to arise relatively early in the 19th century. And if you take it back a bit further, all of the resistance to enslavement, which our ancestors put up on the coast of West Africa, on the coast of East Africa, on the margins of the Sahara, all of that stuff is the first phase and manifestation of anti-enslavement, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial resistance. That's what that was. It's one story. And then as colonialism succeeds chattel slavery, chattel enslavement, our thinkers come rapidly to the idea that we have to fight this beast, and we do. We theorize it as well as practice it. So our history is full of organized resistance, too frequently defeated, but definitely organized resistance that is there from the moment the first white figure puts a foot on the African shore. Now, what happens to enable and to hinder the process of Africans achieving unity in the 20th century and now the 21st century? Let us bear in mind that there is no image of a united state of Africa to call upon. So even though the idea of a united Africa is there and inspirational, there is no, to repeat, historical precedent to call upon in the way that there is in India and China. Something else happens, and this is important, that as colonialism, late 19th, early 20th century colonialism makes an appearance and consolidates, and Africans find that they're having a common experience, that the French don't act any differently from the British, and that the Dutch don't act very differently from the British, and so on. African nationalism in the late 19th, early 20th century is actually on a larger scale than turns out to be the case in the end, because the juridical form that colonialism took when it set up these states that suited itself and not us. Those states came to dominate how, in the end, anti-colonialism expressed itself and got organized. So there's a Nigerian anti-colonialism, there's a Ghanaian anti-colonialism, there's a Sudanese anti-colonialism, there's a Rhodesian, indeed Northern and Southern Rhodesian nationalism, there's a South African nationalism, and so on. And those nationalisms, as they are successful against colonialism, because something happens in the 20th century, which we will give ourselves credit for, and at the same time interrogate ruthlessly. So a key thing that happens in the 20th century, and I've in a way started to talk about it already, is that something called Pan-Africanism emerges, or to put that another way, the name Pan-Africanism is given to something that had already been happening, that had manifested in the Haitian Revolution, that had manifested in all of those anti-slavery uprisings, that had manifested in the Ashanti Wars against the British, that had manifested in, it doesn't matter what part of our continental homeland we look at. So Pan-Africanism from the late 1890s becomes the name of a sectional, but actually objectively, ideologically unified struggle against colonialism, but it's really against imperialism, accepting that for all kinds of reasons, we focused on part of the objective entity. The objective entity was racist imperialism, what the Europeans, whether they were American or British or French or Dutch or German, brought, imperialism. The capitalist system operating overseas, taking possession of our possessions, calling them theirs, and so on and so forth, and setting up companies that claimed to own everything that really was ours. That process. So Pan-Africanism engages in resistance, and it's physical armed resistance. In that First World War, for example, the First European Civil War, so-called, Africans did two things. They revolted against colonialism, and some of them marched off and fought for imperialism. Africans fought for the French, Africans fought for the British, Caribbean Africans fought for the British, and so on and so forth. In my childhood, back to the 1940s, and certainly 50s, when I was conscious of things, there were actually people in the town I come from, at least one man, who'd been a soldier in the First World War, not the Second World War, and had land in a local place called Kildare that had been given to him, in part anyway, as a result of his military service in the First World War. So, 20th century, a focus militantly, theoretically, ideologically against colonialism, with imperialism and capitalism too much in the background. We have the 1900 first Pan-African conference, and it gets counted out of the record because the one that Du Bois did in 1919 gets called the first Congress. Let's leave that to one side, because in between, something extraordinarily important happened, which is that Marcus Garvey came on the scene. And it's important that we understand just how radical but confusingly so, Marcus Garvey was in 1914, because he'd been to the UK, been all over the place. He'd looked at colonialism. He'd spoken to Africans from Egypt, from West Africa, from Southern Africa. He'd already been to Central America, and so he knew the world and been looking around. And his UNIA spoke to a number of things. It spoke to something like setting up a Washington type organization, Booker T. Washington type organization. But it spoke much more grandly than that about a politics of the total liberation and unification of the African people. Garvey was saying in 1914 that certainly by 1920, that Europeans had put down nothing in Africa, and they must leave. And they must leave on the basis of leaving Africa in the hands of the Africans, and that by 1918, people don't understand this, but Marcus Garvey is saying, and saying very consciously, saying in his newspapers, saying in public meetings, that the Russian Revolution is a good thing. What it's doing is liberating the white masses from their white masters, and that's a great thing, and let it extend by all means. But in addition to that, we Africans must recognize that we also need a liberation, and that liberation is from conquest and rule and exploitation by white terrorism, by imperialism, by colonialism. And importantly, in the 20th century, two strands materialize within African anti-colonialism. We have Garveyism, which is saying, leave Africa now, not in any 200 years' time when you've educated us. Leave now. We have everything that we need, all of the intellectual resources, all of the technological resources to run our own affairs, to run one African state. And so he's saying that, and that's one tendency. It gets ignored because somebody much more kind of acceptable because of more formal education, W.B. Du Bois, is running what becomes the Pan-Africanism, 20th century process of Pan-Africanism. It's no more authentically Pan-African. In fact, it's considerably less authentically Pan-Africanism than what Garvey was doing, but it gets ignored. So in the books on 20th century Pan-Africanism, what we see and hear is stuff about the Du Bois and maybe Henry Sylvester Williams Pan-Africanist process that takes us through from 1900 to 1945. And the 8 Marcus Garvey international congresses or conventions of the Negro people of the world just get ignored. And yet they were as fundamentally, and perhaps more fundamentally, Africanist, Pan-Africanist, oriented towards a united, liberated Africa than anything that almost anybody else was saying within the Pan-Africanist movement. And the great thing about the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945 in Manchester is that even though this isn't acknowledged, it's extremely important that we understand that why the 5th Pan-African Congress was so important is that almost everybody there understood that the moment had arrived and maybe even was past. And if it was past, we've got to catch up with it, where we say to the Europeans, and if we leave and if we go, leave we alone, make we run with own thing right now, we can do it well. And that was the commitment to African liberation that came out of the 1945 Congress. And everybody who was there, whether you came from the Caribbean
or from continental Africa. Those forces frequently linked up. So Caribbean and North American men went to Ghana, went to Kenya, went to the Sudan, went all over, and helped in the process of confronting colonialism for national independence. And at that point, we have to wonder how it was that not enough of an effort was put into making sure that the structure, the political structure of our continental homeland corresponded not to the processes and structures that result from what the Europeans had constituted in and after 1884-85 at Berlin. These little territories with borders that were nothing to do with African people's realities, but just to do with the needs of the Europeans to be able to say, this bit is ours, that bit is yours, and so on and so forth. And the yours were never you Africans. The yours were all, England saying to France, over there, for you, and England saying to Germany, over there is yours, and so on. So, in a way, Pan-Africanism has this grand objective: Africa must be free. But at the same time, it takes place within the confines that are dictated by the Europeans, and that they were set up in a modality of dictation from 1984-85. And even the best of our African leaders had difficulty seeing the need to pursue that with absolute ruthlessness and to start the process of effectively building contrary to the objective of effectively post-colonial Africa that reflected everything about colonialism and so was effectively neocolonialism. And everybody knows, or should know, that the independence process begins. A British Prime Minister talks about a wind of change blowing through Africa. Part of that wind of change results in Sudan in 1956 becoming the first independent sub-Saharan African country. Let's be no doubt about it, not Ghana. It's in the following year, but the Sudan, that's the first. But we don't think of it in that way because we think of the Sudan as an Arab place. Not Arab at all. It's almost wasteful to say this, but I had a friend, brother from Barbados, a comrade, who went to Sudan to teach. When he came, no Arabs in the Sudan. Right? Sudan looks in population terms different. Looks like two things. There's a southern bit where the Africans are darker skinned than you and me, and there's a northern bit where the Africans are, broadly speaking, our skin shade, and there's nobody there who fits, or next to nobody there who fits the stereotype image of the Arab. So there are no Arabs in the Sudan. There are Arabized Africans and there are Christianized Africans, and there are native religious Africans, but not Arabs in the Sudan. And that is the first African country to gain independence, sub-Saharan African country to gain its independence, year before Ghana. Now, in that extended moment between 56, 57 and 1963, Africans are involved in debate. Africans know that there should be a united Africa. The only question is on what basis, what shape is it to take? And the Europeans have been so successful in their colonial education, in their colonial structuring of our continent, geographically, politically, and intellectually, that they have already in the 50s and 60s a majority of African leaders, in inverted commas, who don't see what Garvey saw in 1914, don't see what Nkrumah saw whenever he saw it, and he saw it very early because he's a follower, tells us so in the autobiography, what Garvey had seen and what Nkrumah had learned from him, and what too few continental African leaders saw. So two groups emerge on the continent of leaders. And one, the majority, is actually pursuing the objective that the Europeans want them to pursue, and the other, with Nkrumah as a key figure on Garveyite principles, saying that we need a unitary African state with military machinery, with administrative machinery, with going down the line, appropriate developments around language, producing an elite, able to run our affairs as one continent. When, incidentally, in the year 1958, the presence in Africa of some countries that weren't respectful of the notion that colonialism was at an end. So you had Portugal in both Eastern and Western and African places saying that they didn't have any colonies in Africa, that what they had was Portugal overseas. And the French were saying exactly the same thing, trying to hold on to Algeria on the same basis. And the combination of British and Dutch were in South Africa, trying to hold on not just to South Africa, but to Namibia as well, on the basis that the whites there, who had not so much had to contest tropical diseases, because South Africa isn't the tropics, and so they had big numbers, minuscule in terms of the overall population, but big numbers, and they could hold on to that territory, and with support from places like Britain and the United States of America and so on. So in those places, and Kenya was part of it, Africans had not just to accept the flags that were on offer, but to know that armed struggle was going to be the route to the obtaining of whatever form of an independence was eventually won. So we have two things happening, to repeat, people ready to accept flag independence and go along with the European model, which the Europeans were telling them, that's the model we want, and we want you to fight for it. And those people were saying, otherwise, kill them if necessary. Certainly don't agree with them. And when, in 1958, in Ghana, Nkrumah organized two conferences, and they were focused on military liberation, armed struggle. But when African forces gathered, called by His Imperial Majesty in 1963 in Addis Ababa, the division was not in favor of the Africans who wanted to confront imperialism and to structure a united Africa, a properly united Africa with what goes with that, one that would look like a place that had a genuine national government, national military capacity, and so on and so forth, like the United States of America, and like the European Union would eventually become. So there's a majority there, this is repetition, for the European model. Kwame Nkrumah is walking out. I've told the story before. Kwame Nkrumah is walking out. His Imperial Majesty goes and encourages him back. And somewhere in that conference, the representative of Algeria makes a speech. in which he says, we're putting the cart before the horse here a little bit, and indeed perhaps in a major way. A big part of our continent isn't yet liberated. That being so, why are we discussing unity when we don't have the whole of the continent to unite? Why don't we prioritize liberation? And we, the Algerians, having effectively defeated the French, we have skilled, battle-hardened soldiers, and we will supply 10,000 troops to help in the liberation process of the southern part of our continent. Everybody in that conference got up, including Nkrumah, who'd been encouraged back in by His Majesty, for the model of African unity. That's not an assembly of African states properly unified. It's an association of African unity. So it's an association of an abstract idea, not an association of the concrete states. And because it's not an association of the concrete states, the way in which they properly work together, the way in which they surrender power to a central entity, the way in which they diminish the importance of the existing borders for a bigger African single border, our shoreline, the way in which they constitute a single African citizenship, none of that is addressed. And there is a reform movement led by Mbeki decades later, which effectively leaves things in exactly that state, accepting that he tags onto it a very Western-oriented thing. There's a book called Fanon's Warning, which deals with the whole of the structure of what Mbeki implemented in effectively changing the name of the Organization of African States to the African Union. And it makes it look as if they're creating something like the European Union, but they're not. It's simply effectively the old structure renamed with nothing of the fundamental absences of the prior structure being addressed in the structural presences within the new entity, the African Union. And when they make moves to, for example, embrace the diaspora, they constitute or declare the old diaspora to be effectively a geographical section of continental Africa. But it's not actually implemented in any substantial way. And the independent individual countries of continental Africa that have to pass that into their law, as far as I recall or understand, none of them have done it. And even the AU hasn't properly done it, so that it hasn't returned to that declaration that it passed and followed it up. And amongst the ways in which it would have to be followed up would be to do with properly deciding which of the diasporan states are actually states that are African, and how the ones that have populations that are in places that the Africans are in a tiny minority, as not all that tiny, as in the United States of America, or in a massive, with a massive presence, as in Brazil, how those communities, as African communities, can be accessed for a properly organized relationship with continental Africa. Also, what needed to be addressed was the issue of African citizenship. There is not one, but 50-odd African citizenships. Africans outside of Africa, unless you come recently from a particular continental African country, have no right of return. This is contrary to the reality where China is concerned, where India is concerned, where Greece is concerned, where Ireland is concerned, and so on. All of those places, if you come from there, your ancestors, you can go back. And effectively, nobody really asks any question because you're diaspora, descendants of the place returning. Nothing of the kind in continental Africa. And occasionally, for venal reasons, an African president will say, I'm making available easy visas, and diasporans rejoice. But it's a kind of bogus. It's not central to what is needed. And only if the existing structures, so say the AU, was addressing, putting in place what is needed, even if it's the institutionalization of neocolonialism, but a neocolonial Africa doesn't have to be unable and unwilling to implement a single African citizenship. It doesn't have to be unable to work out the need to have proper citizenship-based relations with Africa's children overseas and not be giving priority to the more recent ones than the longer separated ones. So that what I'm talking about is the fact that somebody, a clever continental African, said that in the West, there are two types of Africans. And he's talking about America. So he said there are African Americans, and African Americans effectively are like me, people who are descendants of enslaved Africans. So the old diaspora. And then he says there are African Africans. No, he says American Africans and African Americans. So the American Africans are the more recent ones who migrated there since, and their governments, you go and look, all have more or less direct dealings with them because they're recently departed citizens, and those citizens still have citizenship connections, dual citizenship sometimes with the United States and whatever. And those countries deal with them in a way that they haven't equipped themselves to deal with the older diasporans like us, and we have no right of return. So the prospect of unity depends on how we think through and understand where we are, how we think through and understand the effect of the decision that Europeans made in the 1880s, the follow-through of their decision-making and the education of their decision-making into the heads of Africans, and how that then came to manifest in what emerged in 1963 at the founding conference of the Organization of African Unity, and how what has happened since in the founding of the African Union still represents the follow-through and continued institutionalization of the Europeanized shape of Africa. So that has to be overcome. There are issues to do. If you look at all of the places where there is a notional or actual national unity, China, for example, China claims that its people speak Chinese, and that is not in fact true. They speak a number of languages which are Chinese called Chinese, but if you come from northern China, you probably can't understand somebody from southern China at all. And what they have, and which Africa does not have, is a language that the entire elite spoke. And that's before English. It was there, still there. And the Chinese, long before English or Japanese or any other language imposed itself, they had Mandarin. And everybody who's educated in China is educated in that. So it produced a bureaucracy, produced an educated elite. It produced people who were conscious of and able to call upon all of what I was speaking about when I mentioned a juridical Chinese entity and a cultural Chinese entity that goes back for, let's say, millennia, even if that's a little bit of an exaggeration. So Africa would have to address that absence. And a way in which to do it would be to set about educating an elite, make sure that they speak a West African language, they speak an East African language, that they speak at least two foreign languages. One would be Chinese and the other would be, say, English. I don't know. And that they'd be educated in key sciences, something to do with law, something to do with computing, and so on and so forth. Without that, there's no human basis for the assemblage of an African entity. And then these existing states and the AU effectively stand in the way of even minimally embracing the idea that African unity has to be more than an idea, and that for it to be more of an idea, machinery will have to be in place, and that almost all of the existing continental African state machinery effectively stands in the way of what is necessary for a unified Africa. Now, coming towards the end, it seems to me to matter that those who apparently out of personal self-aggrandizement motives hold on to the existing structures do so with the support of external forces in whose interests those existing structures, the states of Africa and the AU and OAU, function. They don't function in the interest of the African masses. And it's clear, is it not, that when moves are made against European interests, as happened, let's assume it's happening in the case of developments in 3, perhaps 4 West African countries as we speak. Senegal may be the 4th or may not be the 4th, but crucially, popular combined with army forces have made moves to disrupt the way in which French power has been enabled to extract in a unique way African resources in the era of African independence. When that move was made, first in 2 and then in 3 West African countries, Sahelian countries, the West African entity declared that what had happened was anti-democratic and that they were going to use sanctions and may even use military means effectively to restore French ability and capacity to exploit Africa in the old way that it has done since the Second World War, and that all these West African countries would be restoring a democratically overthrown president. Now, that hasn't quite worked out, but the possibility is still, in fact, there for a reversal of that process, whether it's led by the Ghanaian, the combination of Ghana, Nigeria, whatever, or whether forces are found from within 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of those African countries that overturns or stops the process of breaking French power and capacity to exploit in those territories. We don't know. It's early days. And we saw in the case of Burkina Faso that a leader, army-based, popular, not unlike these 3 that are now making some waves in Sahelian Africa, gets overthrown, murdered by somebody close to him, and the murderer remains in office for, how long was it? In excess of 20 years before being overthrown. And yeah, so it's a delicate moment. The crucial thing is that we Africans have to be looking at and analyzing how we've come to be where we are, how we're different from other places that have national unity, all of which are smaller than ours, at the meaning of the fact that there has never been an African juridical entity, not a single African state, what it means to be the case that we don't have on our continent an elite educated in a number of languages, or even one language which they all speak, that many of the people, indeed too many of the people who are talking about African unity in their lifetime, have no analysis of how, if it can be effectively done. We recognize that imperialism has an interest in keeping Africa disunited, with a disunity that takes, broadly speaking, its current form, and the extent to which they put resources into keeping it so, and the extent to which they will enable the anti-unitary forces to win the battle that we have to engage in. So those, if you like, are my thoughts on the obstacles to African unity, and I may not have said enough about the prospects for it, but the obstacles are so daunting that it's important that we understand those, because it's only when we understand what the obstacles are that we can begin to think and organize and take action effectively against them to put something else and something better in its place. So I want to rest there. Thank you for listening, if you have been.
Tenamwari, giving thanks, Elder Cecil. As always, insightful, thought-provoking, and an issue that we need to explore in significant detail more, in my humble estimation. We need to engage in forensic analysis of the problems and prospects towards our unity, because we speak about the need for our unity often, and that requires a scientific approach to achieving it. But speaking of scientific, let me just back for a second, give Elder Cecil a rest, and we'll be back after these messages. So the subject is scientific Garveyism, a working idealism for the 21st century and beyond. Let us begin by defining what is Garveyism. It's a good question, right? So I'm going to read first. It said, the theory and practice of African people engage in liberatory nation building as exemplified by the life and work of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Brother Leader says it is the sum total of the life and legacy of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey, encapsulating the man, the vision, and the plan. Yeah? And as you can see here, for the sake of rhyme, I've added the people. Now, initially I had the man, the people, the vision, the plan. For the sake of rhyme, I put the people, the man, the vision, the plan. Yeah? And I'm emphasizing this because oftentimes we focus on Marcus Garvey, the man. And that's good. It's a good start. Yeah? It's impossible, however, to understand Marcus Garvey outside of the context of the people, yes, from which he came, and the people through which he was organizing. Is everybody following me? Yeah. And I'm going to explain this a little bit further. Yeah, let's go forward as we explain some definitions. Right, scientific, conducted in the manner of science.
You can enslave us with done for 300 years the bodies of men. You can shackle the hands of men. You can shackle the feet of men. You can imprison the bodies of men, but you cannot shackle or imprison the minds of men.
I sparked a blunt before I wrote this, unsure how I approach it. I'm coughing up a lung like I got COVID, gas potent. Snapping on the track like poetry, words spoken. I've been in my feelings trying to find a state to cope in. Justice for
So the subject is scientific Garveyism, a working idea. Yes, indeed, brothers and sisters. Yes, indeed. Scientific Garveyism coming to you on Kulichaguli Day, the 10th, Monday, the 10th of June, and 24 hours later on Ojima Day, Tuesday, the 11th of June, we will be engaging in the Q&A discussion on the subject. And so the presentation will be released on the 10th, and the discussion Q&A will be taking place live right here on gotkushTV on the 11th. So do come through for that conversation right there, and we'll be engaging in a scientific analysis of the theory and practice of what is referred to as Garveyism, brothers and sisters. So I encourage you to come through for that. We are in Q&A territory right now, brothers and sisters. It's Q&A territory right now. So if you want to ask your question in the chat, please feel free to @gotkushTV. So much conversation takes place between brothers and sisters in the chat, and we encourage that. Yeah, so feel free to continue your conversations in the chat. But if you would like your comment or your question read out for the consideration of Elder Cecil and myself, please @gotkushTV, so I can differentiate that comment from the rest of the comments in the chat. All right, brothers and sisters. And if my moderators catch a comment or a question that they think is supposed to be read out, they can act as well, and they will do that for you. In fact, moderators, even if the person didn't want it to be read out, if you feel like it should be considered by myself and Elder Cecil, just feel free to repost with the @gotkushTV so I can catch it. That's one way to deal with it as well. All right, kings and queens.
Is it possible? Is it possible for those to be shared for me?
Yes, there will be. I'll bring them on the screen for you to view. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Elder Cecil, I'm going to begin with a few questions. However, and maybe in a second, brothers and sisters, if you hold tight, we'll share the link, and if you want to come live and interact with Elder Cecil, you can do so. I'm going to share a question with you, Elder Cecil, based upon going towards this issue of prospects. Yeah, you have dealt with the problems and the obstacles, and that is a necessary part of the process. So there's no criticism for that. Yeah, because again, that is very necessary. However, to go more towards the prospects for a second, I'm going to base my question on the work and statement of another luminary who you are very familiar with, Baba Kwesi Pra. Yeah.
Yes.
But for those who are not aware, Baba Kwesi Pra is a Pan-Africanist linguist, historian, among many other things, from Ghana, who currently lives and works in South Africa and has done so for the better part of 20 odd years, if I'm not underestimating the numbers. Yeah,
probably longer than that.
Really longer than that. I know he's been in South Africa for a lot longer than that, but I'm talking about his actual domicile. But yeah, he was there before, during the apartheid era. He was a part of the liberation movement in South Africa as well. And he's done a lot of work in terms of solidifying our understanding of the linguistic cultural unity of Black Africa, to a significant degree, and so he says in the book called Pan-Africanism, African Nationalism, Strengthening the Unity of Africa and Its Diasporas, which is like the findings of a conference that took place, and I forget the year, so forgive me for that. But he said some time ago, in Beyond the Color Line, I made the point that we have got to be wary about what I call continentalism. That is the argument that Pan-Africanism means, still for us today, the unity of the African continent in the first place, a unity of post-colonial states, and not, as I would say and insist, the unity of peoples whose history and culture derive from the African continent and are conscious of this affinity and wish to develop these roots as a basis for the social and economic emancipation of African people. My definition fundamentally recognizes the link with the diaspora as more important than the notion of continental unity per se, which is essentially geographical. In other words, the unity of the greater part of this continent logically would emerge more as a consequence than as a cause. Again, in other words, if people of African history and descent unite, that is, if the African nation unites, most of the continent of Africa will unite. Yeah, and I'll leave the statement up, but I just want to get your considered perspective on that particular perspective from Baba Kwesi Pra.
Okay, I know well, Prof. Bra. I attended his 2014 8th Pan-African Congress, of which perhaps 3 alternatives with the same name have since been organized.
I think there's one soon to occur, if I'm not mistaken.
That's exactly what I mean. I think we're just about moving towards the 9th, but there have been several versions of the 8th in a way right now. Pra is extremely bright and incisive, and I hate to disagree with him. And I don't say that his insights on this doesn't have some merit. The first key merit is that the diaspora matters, and that our continental homeland must recognize the diaspora and be much more open to it than it presently is. And that global Africa, if it's to exist, has to be constituted on the basis of that unity between our continental homeland and its diaspora. So that part, or that strength in Pra's approach, I have no difficulty with. I have difficulty with some other elements of that, because that anti-continentalism involves, although the words conceal it, the anti-continentalism disguises a surrender of the northern part of our continent to forces that are said to be not African because of the cultural definition that's embedded in how the diaspora and the rest of Africa is constituted. Right. So yes, let us say the Black Africa and its diaspora need to be constituted. But why would you want to build a practice on abandoning the northern part of our continent? Inside of Pra's approach to Africa is a notion of borderlands. So there's Africa proper, borderlands, and parts of Africa that's not ours, but Arab or Islamic or whatever. Yeah. And if it is true that that is in his approach, and it is, what do we do with the truth of the fact that the people in the north of Africa, called Arabs and who think of themselves as Arabs, are in fact Arabized and Islamized Africans whose presence is in a substantial part, not just presence, but physical composition, biological composition, is a direct function of the Arab Islamic or Arab-led slave trade, which forcibly took females for sexual union, which forcibly castrated men and left them to supervise these entities where the sexual union under force was taking place. So that is what has produced largely the population of the northern part of Africa. Right. And just as we in the Caribbean what is the population that we have there? We have people who look unmixed African, and we have another set of people who are mixed. We're all broadly, in one mode or another, of rejection, Christianized and Westernized. And so we are a version, and it applies to North American Africans as well. We are a version, but the Christian, Westernized version of the Africans in the northern part of Africa. And it extends beyond that, because I went to Senegal some years ago, extraordinary place. And I come from and left Jamaica when I was 17 or approaching 17 when I came here. But my childhood involved watching people and indeed going with them to church on Sundays. In a Muslim country, there's something striking about streets full of Africans 5 times a day, in the middle of the day, going to prayer. But these are us under the set of beliefs that inspire Muslims to pray 5 times a day. Now, I don't believe that people who do that, whether in West Africa they are unmixed Africans who look like me, or in Northern Africa they're mixed Africans who look like brown Caribbean people, if you know what I mean. I don't believe that Pan-Africanism can take an approach which excludes them from who we mobilize with and over, and in respect of whom we declare our continent one. I do not believe that the northern part of our continent can be or should be abandoned. This is repetition. And I certainly don't believe that we can go to physical war with some people that are called Arabs who are in the north of our continent. What we have to do is get them to realize who they are. And that won't be easy, but that's the task.
You've kind of preempted a question I was going to ask in relation to Sudan. Right, because there are different opinions on this, and it won't be a surprise to you to know that I'm a little bit more given to Baba Kwesi Pra's analysis than you are.
That's okay.
But not necessarily not necessarily disagreeing with everything that you just said, right? Not necessarily disagreeing with what you just said, and I'll come back to why in a second. But now that you've raised this point, and I don't, it's easy for this point to become the rest of the conversation, so I'm going to guard against doing that. But the issue that we have with what you have just said, and I think to a significant degree, we can identify the fact that
I'm listening.
I know. We have much to learn and study about identity and culture in North Africa. Because the popular narrative is often more complex than it appears on the face of it. So let's accept that as a fact. In spite of that, however, there exists in North Africa a distinction along racial lines, that has left the populations of North Africa, who we might refer to as indigenous, dark skin and black, as discriminated against, right?
And sometimes murdered,
right?
As we speak.
In significant ways. And so there is on the level of identity and the African identity, which is a key component of the Pan-African goal and the ideologies that are inspired by it, the identification of being African is essential, and one that is not popularly adopted except for political expediency by a majority of said individuals. Yeah. So as to separate themselves and distinguish themselves from those black people who are south of them, either as a part of their nations or south of them as far as the Sahara is concerned. Yeah, that's exactly why this distinction between sub-Saharan and Saharan, super-Saharan was even created in the first place. Yeah, so we have to consider that. And then I'll give you an example of what I mean. Recently, there's been a couple of incidents in like Algeria and Morocco.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think the example I'm going to give relates to the Morocco example, where a high-ranking politician spoke about migrants coming to the nation and said that they're not us. They want to bring African culture. They want to impose African culture. He used those terms. Yeah. So he's distinguishing himself and the majority of the population in that nation from what he refers to as African culture. And so I believe that what Baba Kwesi Pra is getting at is that we have to organize ourselves on the basis of culture. Yes. And cement a definitive African culture that those who define themselves outside of and in opposition to it must not be cajoled into being a part of it. That we must just organize ourselves based upon the fact that we know we is African, and if them don't want to be it, then leave them to it. Yeah. If that makes sense. And that's a pushback that I think would be in the spirit of what Baba Kwesi is saying. What would you say to that?
It's a powerful point. I know, right? When I just got up, I was reaching back for Kwesi's book, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it's on my shelf, and we were actually quite close until recently. I had problems with what he did with Marcus Garvey.
I'm yet to read that book, you know. Yeah, I've heard your critiques.
It's not widely available. Let's leave that to one side.
Yes.
Now, we all know, and there's considerable evidence of what happened to black-skinned Africans in Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi. The evidence that you just referred to, I haven't seen the Algerian stuff. But Tunisia is undoubtedly a reality, and the person who is in charge there at the moment is an out-and-out anti-African racist. So we don't disagree with that.
Yes.
Right. In addition,
sorry, Elder Cecil. Just to clarify, it's possible that the example that I was just referring to may be Tunisia, and I may be misremembering. So let me just clarify that, just so I don't put out misinformation. It's possible that it could be either of those nations. So clarify that. Yeah, but anyway, go ahead, Elder. Go ahead.
I think it's Tunisia, but one or two of the North African allegedly Arab nations is what we're talking about, and the Libyan stuff is not in dispute. Everybody knows what happened after Gaddafi there to fellow Africans who got defined as not Libyan, even though they'd been in Libya for longer than
of course.
Right. So that's my first response. The second part of my response is that I am 100% in favor of the cultural mobilization that Pra advocates, and it is a site of weakness at the moment that in fact is not happening amongst the Africans who in skin color terms qualify. Where is the African identification continent-wide, even if you're excluding the people in the north of the continent? So the need to embrace that identity is there. And you will find that in the 2014 8th PAC, which I was at, if you look at the resolutions, you will see in that a motion that advocates African communities worldwide organizing as African communities independently of the states in which they find themselves. The two things might complement each other, but that's a resolution in there, and I drafted that resolution. So I'm entirely in favor of the notion that we have a cultural, racial interest to advance and develop. So I'm not in disagreement with Pra, and like I say, inside of his work in the eighth back, you will see a motion that I drafted. You just passed that conference. Now, there is the additional and final point. That just as in the north of our continent, you can have Arabized racist xenophobia. In the south of our continent, in the aftermath of apartheid, you also have anti-African xenophobia being pushed in the interest of Zulu nationalism or in the interest of something called South African nationalism, whatever, stuff being actively pursued with people being killed in the context of localized, sometimes even superior. The South Africans, the ones who are pursuing it, believe themselves to be superior to or to be being deprived of something by these foreigners. That's how the xenophobia functions. And so we deceive ourselves if we believe that the only people who are doing it in continental Africa are the Arabized or Arab types. It's a problem that if we don't manage to solve it in the southern part of our continent, i.e. in South Africa, and some of it is in Namibia as well. I once was on a TV program in Namibia, and the issue of who was an African came up. And of course, on the panel, mine was the strongest voice, saying that African is something to do with color. It's a racial concept, and that Europeans cannot. They can be born in Africa, they can have African citizenship, but they can't be Africans racially because African is a racial term. And I put that argument on the panel, and at the end of the program, a mixed race Namibian came up to me and said aggressively, "You talk too much." So there is a defense inside of people who look like you and me of a weaker notion of what it means to be African than the historic one that Pra and I are actually committed to. So the issue that we face, to summarize, is that I'm not in favor, and I do not join Pra in abandoning the northern part of our continent. Just as we never abandoned the south to the whites, we can't abandon the north to misguided Arab or Muslim or Islamic forces. What we have to do is contest that. It's Africa and it's ours. And there are people there who I believe, even though they're Islamic, and even though they might be, if you like, corrupted by the anti-African elements within Arabism and within Islam, they are us nevertheless, and have to be contested on that ground, and our ground has to win. Otherwise, we're giving up all of what is called North Africa.
All right.
And I'm not for that.
I take your point. As I said, this conversation could take a whole conversation, so we're not going to do that today. I would, except to wait one point though. I think that very few people would argue, for example, that that the whites in South Africa should not be included in what is regarded as African, from a Pan-African point of view. And while there are some that would argue that, they generally don't argue it from a Pan-African point of view, if that makes sense, especially not a revolutionary one. And so I think that
I agree with you. I agree with you. But the whites, whites are keen to pursue it, and you will find it being actively pursued by whites.
Of course, they are.
All of a sudden,
but again, political expediency. This is the point I tried to make.
No,
you know what I'm saying?
I agree with you as to what motivates it, and then the additional and final point, if we're going to leave this, that has to be made, is that one of the things that has happened, and that's what I was talking about in my previous contribution to your show last time, is the way in which insecurity around race and the reality of race and the way in which racism has corrupted the appreciation of race and blackness. Black Africans can end up being comfortable with abandoning the notion that blackness matters.
Right. Understood.
And that feeds into the white interest.
100%. I would say finally, just to be in fairness to Baba Pra, that there are movements across North Africa at the moment that are challenging what might be considered to be Arab supremacy. And even in what you're saying in terms of people that were generally identified as Arab, actually discarding that identification, that's happening. I suspect that Baba Kwesi would be sympathetic to those movements on the basis of the cultural identification. I suspect. I don't know this for sure.
Yes, it's a site of struggle, not a site of political abandonment.
Right.
And so
I understand.
I reject the anti-continentalism insofar as it embraces effectively abandoning the north of our continent. I embrace the Pra position insofar as it's vitally necessary that we mobilize culturally for African identity everywhere Africans are. If Africans are misguided about who they are, then we have a battle to convince them out of their thing, and to unite the diaspora with the continent on the basis of that race identification. Yes.
Point taken. Now, the other element, though, to stick with this statement from Baba Pra again, his final statement here was, if people of African history and descent unite, that is to say, the African nations unite, most of the continent will unite. Yeah. Now, aside from
that's uncontested.
Right. So I was gonna say, because in a sense, right, is there some insight in that in relation to the fact that, to a significant degree, Pan-Africanists and movements have overemphasized state unity over people unity, if that makes sense. Even maybe the resolution that you've quoted from, that you helped draft for the pack that Baba Kwesi Pra led, would speak to that. Like, is there an issue in terms of us seeing our people to people solidarity, organization, functional and operational, not as well invested in as the idea that this state needs to unite with that state, and there needs to be a free trade agreement and free movement of people and all them things there? Is there a contradiction there or conflict there?
No, I don't believe that there's a contradiction, and nor do I believe that there are alternatives. We have to progress at all the levels, and the communities level is vital, and we're failing at that level, as well as also failing at the state level. What was decided at the state level in 1963, and what was decided at the state level in whatever year the OAU became the AU is in state terms inadequate. Africa needs a unitary, unified state. There is no doubt about that. And every effort should be, by all means necessary, being put into bringing that about against the interest of the neocolonial classes and the neocolonial states. right? So we mustn't abandon that objective, and to the extent that it's abandoned, we're endangering ourselves, because we Africans need a state of that kind to protect our interests. Right now, what's happening? The neocolonial states and the neocolonial class is selling out all our resources. The last example that's happening in continental Africa as well. But Guyana, a government of Africans in one moment, government of Indians in another moment, and both of them agree to sell off oil, dangerous oil under the sea, for something like 1% royalty, paying for the investment out of the oil itself. So the companies aren't investing anything, and the companies now own all of that oil. And what has happened is that simply Guyanese oil has been transferred, the ownership of it from Guyanese hands, where it was perfectly safe under the sea, to the hands of Exxon, or the Exxon, whatever.
Exxon and Chevron.
Yeah. And it's actually adding to global warming, which is actually endangering humanity, and it's endangering the whole Caribbean island, because that oil is at such a deep level that if one of those wells explodes, there's going to be nothing to stop it. And we saw how that works on a smaller scale in the Gulf a few years ago when that well exploded. It's the same kind of technology.
Right. So you spoke about two sensibilities, in Pan-Africanism in the early 1900s. One being aligned with the Garveyite tradition, and which is, freedom now on a forget out, and the other is more gradualist. Actually, we want you to educate us until we are sufficiently able to take over our nations, right? Which is true, right? But then during the independence era, the 50s, 60s, 70s, one could argue that aside from the outright sellouts and neocolonial puppets, among those who are a bit more forward thinking, another set of possibilities or prospects arose in terms of the concept of African unity. One which was unitary state now. And the other, which was begin with regional, regional state or regional unity, and then at some point pursue continental unity. Yeah. Now, as you mentioned, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah was a leading light of the former, and one could say, and feel free to correct me if I'm inaccurate here, but one could say that Julius Nyerere was probably the leading light of the latter, the more gradualist in the sense of begin with regional unity. Incidentally, both of them attempted regional state unification, right? But that's neither here nor there. Now, one could say, that in the moment of that hotbed of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist energy, that when we look back in hindsight of history, Nkrumah was correct. That if we were able to achieve that at that time, much of what we see today would not be the reality as it stands. And I think that would be a justifiable argument to make. However, in the current moment, beginning from where we are at right now, does the regional unity school of thought have more viability based upon the current circumstances, or should we be all out Nkrumahist at least on this particular issue, coming from where we are at this moment in time? They say material circumstances, change the trajectory of things. So what's your thoughts on that?
Okay. It's important that we recognize that the regionalism thing had two elements to it. In the late colonial moment, Britain used regional federations as a way of disappearing its colonies into entities that suited it.
Yeah.
And suited its interest.
Yeah.
And to do that extremely cheaply.
Yeah.
So the Federation of the West Indies was one of those.
Yeah.
And it failed because they tried to make the Jamaican masses pay to run it, rather than Britain finding a way to fund that entity properly. That's why it failed. Similar things happened in East Africa.
Yeah.
And I've never understood why that one failed, but that was a British creation, the East African Federation. And it just fell apart because there seemed to have been nothing or nothing like enough there. And the Central African Federation was an entity designed to keep the whites in charge, the Southern Rhodesian whites in charge of not one but 3 countries. So they were supposed to be in charge of Northern Rhodesia and another country, probably the one where anyway, 3 countries. Yeah.
Go on, continue.
Now, those federations all failed, as did the one in East Asia, the Malaysian Federation. So those are British things, and there's nothing in them for Africans. In a way, Nigeria is an earlier one of those that the British established for its own interest. All of them failed. And then we have another historical moment of what looks like African devised regional entities.
Yeah.
ECOWAS and what's it, SADC, if that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah,
that one in Southern Africa. One doesn't argue that they are pointless. The question is, how does one approach them?
Right.
That the Southern African one worked actively against Zimbabwe over the land issue. Yeah. The West African one, and this is because the entities in them are neo-colonies with neo-colonial ideas, not serving the African masses, but serving imperialism and that class, the interest of the class that runs them in combination. So, if you had any doubt about their nature, what happened with ECOWAS? I mentioned it. You know better than me, probably. That development that is happening there, which is directed against France, and the way in which ECOWAS responded was to say that the issue wasn't French imperialism, but defense of democracy. And they have imposed sanctions and they threatened warfare initially, right? So,
Elder Cecil, let me pause you for a second, because I think that we can all agree that ECOWAS and SADC and the rest of them are neo-colonial constructs, just like the African Union. My understanding of the latter of that formation, though, as far as its more progressive inclination, at that time, was to get rid of the colonial borders and form larger nation states. That were not that were Pan-African in their inclination. If that makes sense.
It's that element that I welcome.
Right.
But it's important that even as we welcome it, we see the limitations. And if the entities that are bringing that stuff about are actual neo-colonies, what they're doing won't be objectively to the African benefit. So in the Caribbean, there is something called CARICOM. My Jamaican passport, I think, is also a CARICOM passport or something. It
is.
And in proper circumstances, it's supposed to be able to get me into Barbados. It doesn't. And in proper circumstances, it's supposed to get me into Trinidad. It doesn't. I mean, there's a famous occasion where the Bayesian immigration officer was saying, I can't come in. And Americans with just their identity cards
We're coming in.
We're coming in and going.
We're coming in the other channel. I had a Jamaican passport. So so we don't argue against those entities. What we do is stress their limitations in exactly the way that, slightly unconnected, the issue, excitement generated by that bright and able lady who is now in charge in Barbados. So there's excitement about Barbados.
Mia Motley.
Yes, Ms. Motley. There's excitement about Barbados becoming
a republic.
A republic and ending, the Queen as head of state. Nobody can argue against that.
Yeah.
And so I don't argue against it. What I say is it's not the first Caribbean country to do it. The other ones, if you look at them, which is Trinidad, Guyana, and believe it or not, Dominica, are in fact no different from Jamaica, and nothing has flown directly from the fact that the Queen is no longer their head of state.
I agree.
And so on. And in the one instance where something different happened, which is Grenada, the Grenada Revolution happened with the Queen's representative putting his name to all of the laws passed by the revolutionary government, and only at the end, when the revolutionary government had destroyed itself, and the Americans were coming in, did the Queen's representative suddenly turn. The Queen's representative does what the people's representative tells them to do. So so that's not an argument against republics, right? I'm in favor of all of them becoming republics, but nothing in and of itself flows from republican status. What matters is the politics of the republic. The difference between a Grenada under the revolution, not a republic, but being revolutionary, and a Cuba, revolutionary republic, and very different from all of them excepting Grenada.
Absolutely, so the point that you've made is very important to contextualize it at this moment in time, especially because of all this talk about the East African free trade area and one currency developing among them. What's happening at the moment to a significant degree is that the neo-colonial constructs are borrowing from the Pan-African playbook, so to speak, and dressing up dressing up neo-colonialism with Pan-African talking points, and acting as though it's progress. So it's a very important point that you're making.
Some of that, my own approach might be on that one, might be slightly subtler than that.
Right.
I have no objection to the neo-colonies working more effectively together at the economic level. I have no objections. I have no objection to the neo-colonies abolishing regional basis or whatever. No objection to that at all.
Of course.
My objection is, are they still neo-colonies? And if so, recognizing them as the enemy of the African people, despite the fact that they're facilitating economic change.
No, I think your emphasis is different. I don't think your point is fundamentally different from the one I'm making. Again, I don't have anything against those things, but I don't want people to mistake that those actions as necessarily in and of themselves revolutionary.
No, they're not.
You know what
I'm saying? Absolutely not.
That's the point, right? So and again, the people that are fronting this now are the same forces who 20, 30 years ago were giving us all the arguments as to why they shouldn't be done, right? You know what I'm saying? So them taking it on now is, again, borrowing from the Pan-African playbook, but without the substance, the Pan-African substance behind it. All right. So I'm gonna ask you one more question. I have so many more, but I want to get to the chat. I want to respect the chat. So my next question is in relation to the conceptual and material barriers. Much of what you went through is entirely important, but in my experience, a lot of the barriers to the prospects of African unity are very conceptual. To the extent that, I'll give you an example of what I mean. You spoke about the difference between the OAU and the AU, and from the OAU, flawed as it was, at least had the mission of decolonization. And within that context, an African identity was being actively fostered and developed, at least by the grassroots and those that were around it. The propaganda coming from enemy forces and those who take up enemy propaganda was that effectively there is no such thing as African. And then when the African Union comes around, one of the things that they do is they take the observance of African Liberation Day, take liberation out of it, and we get Africa Day. In the context of the fact that the rise in propaganda is that there's not really any such thing as African. Right? Because African's the most diverse continent, and this tribe doesn't get along with that tribe, and this people is entirely different from that people, and so on and so forth. But when Africa Day comes around, suddenly we're allowed to celebrate being African once again. As long as we don't put any political revolutionary ideas behind it, right? And another contradiction here is that the same people that, once again, this is a diaspora thing now that will tell us really Africa is a continent. It's impossible to have an African identity because Africa is a continent full of 50 odd countries, and Africans on the continent don't see themselves as African. But suddenly, if somebody says Nigerian or Ghanaian, Congolese, Kenyan, South African, suddenly those constructs become legitimate, even though we know that all of those constructs were developed and derived from, as you've mentioned, the 1884, 1885 Berlin Conference, right? So there seems to be a disconnect in logic in terms of what people are inclined to accept as legitimate, and condemn as illegitimate. My question then is a bit of a theoretical one and a conceptual, abstract one. Is a lot of the impediment here purely conceptual, that we cannot get over a colonial conceptual barrier, that we accept and legitimize colonial constructs and reject African revolutionary ones just because we have a colonial mentality?
Good and complex question. Now, I think that African identity has revolutionary implications and can be used as a revolutionary mobilizing ideological agent. But in and of itself, it's not revolutionary.
Right.
It's about the recognition and affirmation of a biological stroke cultural reality. Now, because that identity is connected to an exploited people, and because part of the business of organizing opposition to that exploitation and domination is actually cultural, then even though it's not initially revolutionary, it's so close to that that it is next to no point in not all along using it to revolutionary ends or trying to do so. Right. Okay. So that's one point. Another point might be to do with the extent to which, because we are in a complicated, confusing moment, people are both more confused than they are and less confused than they are. There's nothing necessarily wrong with people identifying that. I'm actually quite interesting and proudly Jamaican. right? African Jamaican, right? And that's a part of being African. It's a small part of being African. And I expect that a South African or a Kenyan could have the same kind of identification with the part of Africa that they come from, and be entirely able, like me, to be, or trying to be, globally revolutionary African. Right?
Yes.
And right. So that's the possibility, I think, that we have to fight for. And we don't have to worry, unless it's being used in reactionary ways, of local identifications, because they have value. Right?
Of course.
I'm on a radio program and people come on and talk about being Igbo. And I understand where they're coming from. I can see the difficulty that it poses for another identity called Nigerian. I can see that it poses a difficulty for another identity called Yoruba, and so on and so forth. But these are genuine identifications. They're genuinely part of bigger identifications. And what we have to work towards is those identities not being used to reactionary ends, and none of those identities being used as a basis for oppression of other peoples and identities. And if we can manage that, it'd be fine.
Absolutely.
So we're in a world where the Russians allegedly invade Ukraine. Everybody knows that they are stupidly provoked by an idiotically expanding NATO. Everybody knows that, if you think about it for a moment. NATO has no business expanding eastwards, because Russia isn't their enemy. And to pretend that Russia is their enemy is an idiocy. Right.
It's
so
nonsense.
So Russia gets provoked, and they, in inverted commas, invade Ukraine. And somebody who's a foreign minister of Kenya gets up in the UN and makes a speech about democracy, and makes a speech about and you'd never know that this man is from Kenya. And you'd never know that he has a history less than 50 years ago of Britain running concentration camps in Kenya. You'd never know that they tried to hold on to the Kenya highlands, having pushed his own people, I think it's Kikuyu, off their land. And so here is a neocolonial entity, and one of the institutions of that entity doing what we in Jamaica call farming fool on the international stage. In the interest of who? In the interest of Western imperialism, in the interest of Britain and America. Since that time, and I don't know what he said about it, we've seen that same Britain and America and France and Germany that were talking about Russia invading Ukraine, watching and enabling a genocide in the middle. What in Gaza? I saw something where Kenyan workers were thinking about going to work in Israel to replace Palestinians that the Israelis had locked out.
Wow. Kenya's doing the most right now. Sorry, go ahead, Elsa. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so the institutions of neocolonialism that went through colony and are now neocolony and went into OAU and into AU represent serious obstacles to the realization of what Africa needs, which is a properly unified state, probably supported by linguistic training of its elite, properly recognizing that we have economic and other interests to defend, and that we must defend them in the way that the Chinese have been able to do, or even India, which has a national bourgeoisie which is against the Indian masses, are kind of able to do enough to be able to be investing in the British steel industry and British car industry when the British ruling class can't or won't do it. So all of that is on the table, and all of it is what we have to talk about, organize around, organize against, and so on.
All right, give thanks, Elder Cecil. I've got some questions on the economic front, but I'll hold them for now. Let's get through some of the chat stuff. Anthony, greetings, my brother, says that's a great topic, continentalism. I'm reminded of the decision not to allow Haiti membership in the AU. Got a comment on that, Elder Cecil? And by the way, just Kenya is also farming the fool currently right now, brothers and sisters, in Haiti. But I have our brother Jafrik Haiti coming on later this month, and we're going to be delving into that, the dynamics of what's happening in Haiti at the moment soon. So
importantly, Kenya mustn't put any troops into Haiti, because what happens when where the troops come from is that they kill Haitians.
Right.
The Brazilians did. The people from Nepal just brought cholera. Why would Jamaicans troops who kill Jamaicans in something to the tune of something like 200 per annum be in Haiti, other than killing people and so on? I don't know the answer to the problem of what's happening in Haiti at the moment, but the one answer that I know isn't the right one is sending neocolonial troops in there to help bring peace.
Absolutely, it never work. You know what I'm saying?
And to get back to our brother Anthony, let me say that in a way I dealt with this in my turgid talk. The AU has a declaration regarding the diaspora. It has relations with the neocolonial entities and real relations with CARICOM over all kinds of matters. But they haven't actually, I think the word is ratified, their declaration about the
sixth region,
the fifth region. They haven't, and no continental African country actually formally has. And so even though Haiti is very clearly an African state, I mean, 90-odd% of the population, Jamaica the same really, but much more so, much less mixed in Haiti. So it's clearly an African state, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be in the AU, excepting that the AU isn't ready. And as it happens, the AU, if it thought about itself and fixed itself up, could be ready to have that particular African people and state as a member of the global African Union.
Absolutely. Anthony goes on, the nations of North Africa, the Maghreb, are all members of the Arab League. This is true, Elder Cecil.
No, undoubtedly. And so my response to PRA includes acknowledging that there are all kinds of problems. During the Trump presidency, and there's some black people who think that Trump is a good thing. But let's leave. During the Trump presidency, Trump went to Israel, declared the West Bank not occupied but properly part of France. Part of Israel. Declared Jerusalem the capital and moved the U.S. embassy there. This is clearly recognizing and legitimating what the Israelis have done in East Jerusalem, which is to Judaize it and exclude the Palestinian Arabs and so on. But he did more than that, Trump. Trump ran a policy which I think the present man is continuing, of trying to get the Arab world to regularize or normalize relations with Israel. This is while they were terrorizing Palestinians in the West Bank. And if Hamas had not acted on the 7th of October, almost certainly Saudi Arabia would have recognized Israel. Yeah. And Trump went so far as to say that he was in favor of Egypt attacking Ethiopia, so Arab versus Black, over water, and whether the Ethiopians were entitled to make the dam that they are making inside of Ethiopia. Trump was in favor and said so of, Egypt entitlement to go to war over that. So the reality in the north of Africa and between Africa and the Arab world is that the right-wing leadership of the Arab world, in addition to being racist and idiotically pro-Western Arab, represents part of the challenge for us. And what has to happen is that what the West calls disparagingly the Arab street has to win power in those Arab countries against the Arab leadership that's presently selling out their resources and selling them out generally and compromising with the West. It's a disgrace the way in which the West and Israel have been able, in those alleged negotiations, to send a man, the American foreign minister, to Arab countries and to conduct discussion with him while his government is supplying all the bombs to Israel that it needs for the current destruction and genocide, and while his government is opposing a ceasefire, which they're still opposing, while his government, instead of telling Israel you have to let in food into Gaza, sets about to build a port that leads nowhere, that is so idiotically built that the first storm mashes it up and so on. And they started in January, and 6 months later in June, next to no food is going into and Arabs sit there and talk to them as if they're decent human beings. And Egypt sits there. Now, if I'd been the Egyptian government, I would have said, right, I'm not taking you on Israel militarily, but trucks have to go into Gaza. The road beyond the border needs to be cleared. So I'm putting bulldozers in front of the trucks, and we're sending in food, and let the Israelis attack it. Right? I'm serious.
I hear what you're saying.
And instead of that, they sit there and they allow the Americans to say, don't attack, what a little city name? Jaffa? What name?
Rafah.
Right. Don't attack Rafah. The Israelis are not only attack Rafah, they're mashing it up, which is the objective of destroying every urban entity in the place. But they've taken control of the border between Israel and Egypt. The Egyptians can't even send any trucks through there anymore. How do self-respecting Arabs act like that?
Yes.
And are they self-respecting? So when I say that I'm not in favor of an approach to Pan-Africanism that surrenders our continent to anybody, it includes, and especially, not surrendering our continent to those people with that leadership right now. Yeah,
I understand. So, Anthony says, and I won't get a response to this, so we can move on. But he said the president of Tunisia, it just touches on a point that we've already touched on.
Yes,
the president of Tunisia said that he wanted to send black Africans away back to their countries. Bigging up Kushti's in the building. And she says, I know a leader of a country in East Africa did a speech regarding to drop the Arab title and be proud African recently, and I'm not sure if you already shown it or brought it up. I am not aware of this, So yeah, I'll be interested to hear more. I'm not sure if you're aware of this.
I've missed that one myself.
Yes.
Right now, the truth of the matter is that the Arab countries of North Africa are both
sorry,
in
Cecil, sorry, but this says East Africa.
No, East Africa, it don't matter.
But I was gonna say because it says East Africa, I would assume that this is Sudan. So I'll have to.
No, it might. No, I don't think it's Sudan. It's more likely to be Uganda.
Right.
But I don't know. I haven't heard that said, or even Tanzania.
Or
but
Zanzibar.
I haven't heard that said.
Yeah.
But so
yeah. Take your point.
The point I'm going to make is that there is no getting away at the moment, and there has for a long time not been any getting away from the fact that the Arab North African countries are both in the Arab entities and the African entities, and they are very influential in the African entities. That, for example, explains why PRA's 2014 8th Pan-African Congress had been reorganized under the same name repeatedly, because the main political drift of that 2014 8th PAC was anti-continentalism and did have a serious focus on understanding Arab enslavement of Africans and so on and so forth. That was the key content. And Arabized and Islamized Africans objected to that. And in addition to that, PRA organized or paired to organize, or could have been said to be organized outside of the framework that had been established at the 7th, where there's allegedly a headquarters in Uganda of the Pan-African process. And I think it was possible for confused African countries like Ghana to join with the Ugandans and say that what happened in South Africa in 2014 wasn't a real Pan-African Congress, which appears to be what part of how you explain, and it never happened before. Up until now, there's been next to no confusion about the numbering of conferences. The first one gets numbered or not numbered, depending whether you call it a conference or a congress. And if you don't call the 1900 one a congress, then the first congress happens organized by Du Bois in 1919. But that's a minor thing. And a big thing is the exclusion of Garvey's clearly Pan-African 8th convocation of the Negro people from the Pan-African list. But organizing repeatedly 8th Pan-African congresses to deny and bury the fact that that one happened legitimately, politically legitimately in South Africa in 2014 is an extraordinary thing.
Yes, absolutely. 1 second, let me just get aligned with this thing again. Kushti says, very good point regarding abandoning the land, as we didn't in the South, Baba Cecil. So yeah, she just applauding your point on not abandoning the North of Africa. Brothers and bigging up Lady D in the place. I get the impression that you are trying to ask a question for the panel because of Kushti's comment to you, but I haven't seen your question. So if you could please repost it, Lady D, and I'll get to it. And please at gotkushTV when you post it, so I can identify it. Or if any of the mods have seen it and I've missed it, just please copy and paste and at gotkushTV so I can come to it. All right. Giving thanks, brothers and sisters. Oh, Cecil, you mentioned about citizenship.
Yes.
And passport and all these things, and we're gonna wrap up soon, by the way, because I know it's getting late. But this is an issue that I understand, and I think that one of the things that we should pursue, as far as Pan-Africanists and Africans, especially those of us who are returning home, that we should campaign for when we return home, wherever the nation state and so on and so forth. But I've seen this weaponized against Pan-Africanists. The fact that African states do not have a policy, a general policy of granting rights of stay, citizenship, you know, them kind of things. There are 2 Africans from the diaspora as a reason why the Pan-African mission and the Pan-African movement is 1, outdated, 2, utopian, and 3, should be disregarded. Yeah, because Africans on the continent supposedly don't recognize I and I. Yeah, and I'm slightly critical of an overemphasis on citizenship, and I don't want to be mistaken. It should be pursued. Yeah, but my critique comes from the fact that the states as they are currently constructed are fundamentally anti-Pan-African, right? You know what I'm saying? And so I wonder if it's a contradiction, Elder Cecil, or are we in danger of overemphasizing the issue of a passport and visa and visa what's it called, restriction, to the detriment of the broader Pan-African mission? Is that something that we're in danger of doing?
No.
Or compromising the broader Pan-African
we have to be clear about what the broad Pan-African mission is and stand by and defend and expand it.
Yes.
Passports matter.
Yes.
And what continental Africa should do and could do, and should have done a long time ago, is decide that they're really, despite the 50-odd countries, have 1 passport, 1 citizenship. I saw, and it was put up, I think, as a cause of worry and concern, but Dangote, the Nigerian industrialist, was correctly complaining that to do his business across continental Africa, he needs 30-odd visas. Now, even if you are a dyed-in-the-wool neocolonialist, that clearly is an idiotic state of affairs. in exactly the way that coming from Jamaica or Trinidad in the Caribbean, you should only need 1 passport to travel around that region. Right? Now, a long time ago, CARICOM should have had 1 passport, right? Now, so there is no argument, not any real and powerful one, against there being 1 African citizenship. And nor is there legitimately any proper basis for Africans, unlike everybody else in the world, not having a right of return to our continental homeland.
But this is the point. This is the point of this, Cecil. So me and you, if we were to do our DNA right, you know, you'd say Ashanti, you'd say Yoruba, you'd say Igbo, you'd say Mande, you'd say Mandinka, right? So effectively, there's our 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different countries, that our ancestry states as it exists today, that our ancestry that connects to. That didn't exist when we were taken from the continent, right? And so what I'm asking, because
those so-called tribes did exist then.
No, but the states didn't exist.
No, the states that,
right. Right. So and the passport is connected to the state. It's not connected to the so-called tribe. It's connected to the state. There's no Igbo passport, no Yoruba passport. You know what I'm saying, right? And no Ashanti passport.
So it's not Igbo. It's not Igbo or you know, Ashanti passport that we're after.
No.
It's 1 African passport that we're after.
But the point I'm making is,
it doesn't just harm us, my brother. It harms continental Africans.
I agree.
And what is happening in South Africa now? With that what's the word that we were using earlier? The
Sadak.
No, man. The basis of discrimination, the xenophobia.
Xenophobia, yes.
That xenophobia that's rampant there is a direct function of, and it's a carryover from apartheid, where somehow South Africa wasn't in Africa.
Yes.
And African South Africans actually have half internalized that and feel superior to the Africans from elsewhere on the continent. So we have enough battles to fight, but there is no good reason why there are 54 or whatever it is African passports.
Right.
And it is not, we shouldn't be saying that this is unimportant. We should be saying,
it's not. The African passport is not unimportant, and I'm not even saying getting a passport for one of the 54 states is unimportant. I'm more focusing on the emphasis on citizenship from the states, the current states as they exist. Because the Pan-African, the typical Pan-African position is the borders are illegitimate, right? You know what I'm saying?
No,
So
I agree with that. But until the fundament, right? And there are two fundamentals. You just mentioned one, which is that the whole division is idiotic and anti-African. So that's one fundament. And below that, there's another fundament, which is that those 50-odd countries could easily declare one passport, just as Western Europe, 29 countries, they now have one passport. The British just given up the European passport. They only have one passport, you know.
One passport,
and all of them function within that, despite remaining states. So it's not impossible. It's not even particularly difficult. Right?
It's not.
So that continental Africa, even in its neocolonial state, should address properly. And we diasporans should be saying, we want you to do that. And continental Africans on the ground should be saying to their governments and to their international entity, the AU, we want you to do that. And the national passports matter, because if you go there and don't get one, and we might have talked about this on this program before, but there are people who go to continental Africa and get kicked out after 25 years because a government comes in that don't like them, and that's just wrong. And it's unnecessarily wrong. Now, presumably, if you have a terrorist government or president, the fact that you have a passport wouldn't protect you. But just the other side of that, the passport matters.
Yes. Absolutely. Okay, give thanks for that. Just to put in that point out there. I got two more questions over the and then we can close it. I may. So in relation to you spoke about the issue of the independence era, that gave birth to a stagnated revolutionary era, which was overtaken by a neocolonial era. And you mentioned the fact that the majority of the people who were in the elite, the leadership at that time, were pursuing basically Western ideals, Western dictates, responding to Western instruction. There's been a lot of propaganda recently that is attempting to retell the history of that particular period, with the suggestion that the problem that arose at that time, that is having an impact to this day, is the fact that basically the entire continent adopted socialism as its economic philosophy. And I actually touched
You've been
on
listening to Kofi.
No. Oh no. Oh no. But I assume that he would agree with the people that say this, right? And I touched on this, by the way, brothers. This is in a presentation that I delivered at our last Shemira, or Shemira before last, but I released it recently under the title of throw away the image of the white man's God. Yeah. But this is how they're retelling the history of the continent. Now, you and I know my critiques of socialism as it manifested in the Pan-African movement. Yeah, as a result of my ideological trajectory. We have our critiques there. But it is, in my humble opinion, manifestly false to say that most of the continent adopted socialism in the independence era. Like but could you just address this argument, please, and put it into some context? Like, why is that argument fundamentally false?
Okay. Again, we're in an area of some complexity. And our positions on these matters, even though we love each other, might differ just a little bit. I don't have a position against socialism. I have a position against racist socialism. I have a position against racist Marxists who are trying to teach me Marxism when I know it better than them. So there are some problems. You're absolutely right that Africa did not, on the whole, adopt socialism. Some of them tried, not all that well, planned economies, and planning economies is very difficult, right? The Russians found that with the machinery to do it. They found that. So there is all of that.
Is a planned economy synonymous with socialism?
Well, in objective history, it's only socialists, as far as I remember, who've tried to plan economies.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I would disagree with that. And I was talking for another time. Go ahead.
So if you look at post-war Western Europe, you can talk about indicative planning in France and so on and so forth. So it's not that there's no planning, but if you're planning properly and have to take control of significant parts of the economy in order to at least pretend to have the power to do stuff, then generally speaking, only socialists have attempted that.
Right.
So there's a further step back that has to be made, which is that the reason all of this talk against socialism is now coming up is that socialism, done whether well or badly, starts from a recognition that the people at the bottom of the world have an interest against another set of people who are at the top of the world and who run the world on the basis of capitalism, imperialism. And that's a system that right now is taking away more from the people at the bottom than it ever has historically. Right? And that's a socialist doctrine. Although non-socialists are increasingly seeing it because it's so manifest that is what is happening. The rich list and the absence of justification for the rich list and the disasters that capitalist imperialist greed can produce. We have two recent examples, big ones. The 2007-2008 crisis, which we're still paying for, which ordinary poor people, black and white, paid for, where in the United States of America, the net wealth of Black America declined by a dramatic amount as a result of the greed and folly of the finance sector in the previous period, right? So a socialist perspective on what is wrong with the world has a great deal to recommend it. And it's important that we acknowledge that, even if we're not saying that we're going to try to organize a socialist revolution tomorrow or anything like that, because the socialist case against imperialism and capitalism is very powerful, and all of the ammunition has been supplied by capitalism, imperialism.
Of course.
if you take another step back, Marx was saying 150 years ago that capitalism has the technological productive capacity to produce riches for the world, right? And that the issue was distribution and over concentration in too few hands and so on and so forth. It's capitalism hasn't had that productive capacity. It's reduced it and organized it for profit. And we've ended up in a disastrous position where the world is threatened by one of the outcomes of that, which is global warming. And it even looks, I don't know if you had this on your program or what your position is on it, but it looks very much as if, as a result of Western capitalist technology, that as a result of Western capitalist technology, global warming has already gone too far, and that the efforts that are currently being made to reduce it are too late, and that has major implications for our grandchildren. But the effects are happening now, right? London needs, as we speak, a better flood barrier. New Orleans, which had that hurricane, where did name?
Katrina.
The Bush government did not build back those levees to stand up against a storm powerful than the one that flooded New Orleans. So the next one of that strength will flood will flood New Orleans again. Up that North American coast since Katrina, there's been hurricane after hurricane that has wreaked enormous damage. The polar ice caps, both of them are melting incredibly rapidly. That water is not just raising sea levels, it's falling back in flood-producing torrents all over the world. It's disrupting the atmosphere, and planes will soon be dropping out of the sky. Now, when you're in an aircraft, you have to remember, this has come about in the last 2 or 3 weeks or so, you have to remember to remain in your seatbelt, to remain strapped into your seatbelt because of turbulence in the atmosphere. East Africa, that used to be subject to very few hurricanes, has more floods and hurricanes that you can think of. They don't call them hurricanes, they call them cyclones. It's the same thing as hurricanes. They don't hit West Africa because they start there and come out towards us on the other side of the Caribbean. But it's the same thing. They have to come across the Indian Ocean. They never used to be that powerful. Warmer seas make bigger cyclones and hurricanes, and they're impacting East Africa in a way that they didn't used to. So we have a duty, even if you don't turn socialist overnight, to see that the Marxist analysis of the idiocy and wickedness of capitalism, imperialism is a very sound analysis. Right? You mightn't go all the way with Lenin. Right?
Yes.
And stuff has happened since, right? About whether it's really possible to eliminate the market and use
of course
central planning and all that. So there's whole heap of questions. But at fundament, the people who are arguing against socialism are telling lies about its adoption and application in Africa, although some strange things happened, Kenneth Kaunda, who everybody knows wasn't a socialist of any kind, at one time declared for scientific socialism. People forget that. It's absolutely true.
Yes. But this is the point that earlier said, so because one should be, and the people that are fronting this argument would, if their ideological position was in jeopardy, should be able to distinguish between a declaration of an individual and their actual policy. in government.
But
You know
they're
what I'm
not.
saying?
It doesn't suit their interests, which is why
Right.
they're running. Which is why they're
This
running the
argument,
argument. Because the argument that the disastrous state that Africa is in flows not from the failure of capitalism manifested through neocolonialism, but flows instead from socialist mismanagement, is an argument that capitalism needs and its supporters need.
Right. And I make that argument in Throw Away the Image of the White Man's God, that it's principally designed to deflect from the impact of the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization.
Exactly so.
And the impact that they have had on Africa and the Caribbean.
Yes. And all of those agencies that you just mentioned are subordinate agencies of international capitalism, the places that run the world, from Washington and Paris and London and Bonn.
Absolutely. As a point, more nations on the African continent adopted structural adjustment programs from the IMF and the World Bank,
and did socialism.
And adopted socialism, right? So that's a fact, yeah. All right, Olisa, so my last, because I asked you that question because of the fact that a significant amount of the propaganda, because we have to contend with the fact that our ability to unite as African people, to a significant degree, is a product of the fact that our minds have been shaped by propaganda against it. And some of that propaganda has come in the form of the discrediting of our revolutionary movements and leaders who advocated it. Yeah. And so if Nkrumah mash up the continent, basically, then why are we shouldn't really be like Obama said when he went to Africa after when he went to Ghana, that the future of Africa won't be created by great men such as Nkrumah and others. He said that it will be about the institutions. Yeah, right. You know what I'm saying? So it's necessary for us to put that into context in that regard. And so go on.
No, you go on for the moment.
Yeah. So I wanna, but that now, and I was discussing this with my brother when I was in Atlanta. By the way, you must know the name Ayusi Kwayana.
Yes, I know. I met him and I know exactly who he is. Yes.
I met him last month.
Sidney King of old. He's now approaching 100.
He's 99 years old.
Yes,
and
exactly
I met him last month and was able to sit down with him for hours.
Wonderful.
And converse. The man is still sharp, Elder Testo. Still sharp.
Yes.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Ayusi Kwayana is a stalwart of the African Center Black Power and Pan-Afrikan Movement in Guyana. He's before Walter Rodney. He's Walter Rodney elder. Yeah.
Yes.
And he understood early from the 1950s the need for an African cultural revolution in Guyana. What are you holding up there? Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
His book on Walter. His
right.
little pamphlet on Walter.
Yes. You know what I'm saying? And that's I met him and his son last month in Atlanta. Very, very powerful. Oh, it was an honor to meet him. Yeah.
Yes.
That was an aside.
Yes.
So that we're being encouraged to disconnect ourselves from that revolutionary history at the same time as the forces of white power and Western imperialism are still trying to solve the problem of that same period, after their tribal war, mass European war too. But then let's end now on, because we focus on the continent a lot today, and let's end by focusing on the diaspora, particularly Africans in the Americas, in the Caribbean, because there was a connection and in some ways a demand coming from Africans in the Caribbean to Africans on the continent, to the governments on the continent, which probably is best exemplified at the Six-Pack, or most explicitly exemplified at the Six-Pack. There was a whole region of people that came from the Caribbean and contributed to the resolutions and debated the brothers and sisters, on the continent, and had some agreements, some disagreements, and so on and so forth, right? But there was an active movement that understood our Africanness at that time. And that sensibility has been steadily eroded from that time until now. To what extent do you see Africans of the Caribbean, I'm going to focus on Africans of the Caribbean for a moment, as a defining component of African unity? And what do you think we need to be doing, as grassroots organizations, or as states, or as grassroots organizations, putting pressure on our states to realize, what prospects are there for us as Africans in the Caribbean to forward the agenda of the unity of African people worldwide? What particular role should we be playing?
Okay, I think some clarity is required. And when you talk about how things were in the 60s and 70s, you're talking about a moment in history which was inspired and informed by ongoing national liberation struggles, either in Africa or in
absolutely
in Asia, or
absolutely.
even in South America. That's what inspired both our music, the elements that address that. That's what reduced the space of leaders who all, for example, embraced the notion that South Africa had to be liberated. And even, I mean, you won't find, apart from Hastings Banda, anybody who said otherwise. So that was the nature of that moment, and that's what generated the movement. It made Rastafari, here, as we were talking about at the beginning of the session, right? Now, what has happened since is that even when armed struggle was the means by which flag independence was achieved, whether it was by peaceful means or by armed struggle, flag independence has led everywhere to neocolonialism. And that is the current site of struggle. And it's incredibly difficult to move in it because so much confusion is generated by its nature. So in the United States of America, you have Obama and you have a whole set of African American politicians who, almost without exceptions, are reactionaries, or if they're not reactionaries, have the political limitations of trying to operate under capitalism in the belly of the beast, and are just, dancing about because nothing can be achieved in those circumstances. Or you have a place like Jamaica or South Africa, but let's stay with Jamaica. Limited resources, a ruling class that's willing to act at America's behest, including fighting a civil war over nothing, because Michael Manley wasn't an enemy of that of his own class, and mash up the economy for that. So that's where we have to build back from. And I was last in Jamaica and functioning politically there. It's now approaching 15 years ago, because I came back here in 2009. But 15 years ago in Jamaica, the forces that were willing to sit down together to march together against state terror, against whatever, right? There's nothing to, right? And there was no movement. The people, the theoretical ones, theoretically informed ones from the decade before, where they'd got their PhDs, migrated to the United States of America, or they concentrated on getting their PhDs and migrating, or they moved into the political mainstream. And so what you had to work with politically was a tiny group of Rasta people, and some of them were poor. So if they came on demonstration that you invited them to, they expected you to be able to fund their travel.
Yes, and so on.
And so
these are real problems.
Because that's how they've been brought up. If you're organizing politically, you must be a big man, and if you're not a businessman, what you're doing organizing? Because the PNP and Labour, when they bring them out, feed them, right? So if you're right, so all of that just one specific experience, but all of that is how those allegedly third world, continental African or Caribbean places are constituted. So that's a problem. How do you organize?
Yes.
Even day to day, on that terrain. And then there's something else that was worrying then and is still worrying. Jamaica is 90-odd% seriously African. How is that reflected in political organization of the African community in that place? Minimally. So there's symbolic things around reparations, which is not particularly well understood. There's symbolic stuff around visits by African leaders. There's symbolic stuff around, say, 1865 and Paul Bogle, but there's no African Jamaican organization apart from Rastafari, which is itself split into too many houses, to be doing anything. So my motion from the 6th or 8th, from the 8th back, has no way of effectively operating because the community doesn't have a consciousness and the machinery for moving as a community. The same thing applies to African America. The same thing applies in Brazil. So if when the AU said that we want partnership with the diaspora, go back and look at how the diaspora organized, and whether we organized properly, whether we looked at setting up appropriate structures for talking to ourselves and then representing ourselves on continental Africa. Look at what happened in Brazil. Look at what happened in the US. Look at what happened in the Caribbean. Look at the idiot organization that emerged allegedly to meet that to meet that challenge. So that's part of the problem. We're just at that kind of level, inadequate. If you turn to the surviving elements of the UNIA, what do you see, right? And you know, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at it in Jamaica or in North America. There's some elements of disappointment, there's serious questions that have to be asked. So we Africans are letting ourselves down by how we are organizing in this moment after the excitement of the 60s and 70s when we were inspired by liberation struggle, when it's died down. And we've got to find a way to pick back up the struggle and get on with, you know, building consciousness and building organization. And
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Elder Cecil. A quick point. Anthony has raised a historical point, and I understand the history slightly differently. So I wonder if you can clarify. Walter Rodney says Walter Rodney wasn't allowed to speak at the Six Pack in 1974. President Nyerere
Walter was ill.
I was going to say, my understanding is that he was not well, but he did
Walter
submit.
was ill.
he did submit a paper to the conference.
Yes.
That paper was accepted.
His paper, that is one of the most important things Walter ever wrote.
I
agree. His paper for the six-pack, right?
Yes.
Very important. And my understanding, he wasn't there, and he wasn't there not because he wasn't allowed to speak, but because he was ill and didn't get back to that conference.
What's the I'm trying to remember the name of the paper. So people can search it up. 1 second. Let me see if I can find the name of the paper, because it's a very important aspects of the international class struggle.
Yes, something like that. But it's basically it's in all over the place. It's in all of the books. The Black Liberator republished it. Our brother from Jamaica, who's a professor in the States, what's his name? The papers from the six-pack, all of them have Rodney's paper in it.
Right, but it's worth noting.
Horace Campbell's collection has that paper and so on.
Just to say
I just want to pick up on something that questioner mentioned. He's been on all the time. Maybe he's Guyanese. Is he Guyanese?
No, I know he's living in the United States. Let's put it that way. I know he's connected with us from Grenada before, but I don't believe him to be Guyanese.
All right, let me just respond very quickly. Walter didn't particularly want to stay in Tanzania. He'd done his work there, and he really wanted to go back to Guyana. He went back to Guyana, which was a very challenging place to go back to. He was entitled, more than entitled, to what he was initially going back for, which was the professorship of history at the University of Guyana. The then president of Guyana, Forbes Burnham, a brilliant but wrong-headed man, stopped or overturned Rodney's appointment to the professorship. And Burnham knew that Walter would represent a challenge, and stopping him from obtaining the job for which he was qualified was meant to stop him staying there, because he's an academic and you're not giving him any job. What are you going to do? Right? And they also put pressure on his wife, who was a highly qualified nurse, and then they mocked Walter for living off his wife, which he wasn't doing. And what is more, and this matters, they criticized his level of organization and the paper that he was putting out, which was called Day Clean. And the reason that paper had relatively low production values was because the printing machinery and other equipment and material that Walter sent into Guyana on his way there for what became his political group was all seized by the government, who even seized typewriters and Gestetner machines and so on. So Walter went back into a terrain where Burnham was running effectively a terror regime, which appealed to Africans because he sold the story that what he was doing was preserving this African territory, or this territory that Africans had built from Indians who had been brought in after enslavement and privileged, and look where they are now, right? And those are the circumstances in which Africans who didn't have maybe a Marxist or socialist analysis of what was happening in Guyana could buy into what Burnham said he was doing.
Yeah.
But what he was doing had to be opposed, and Walter, by opposing him over those 6 years, he got back there in 74 or 75, and was killed by them in 1980. And the fact that he was killed by them is not in any doubt. We knew right from the start, but there was eventually an investigation carried out, paid for by the PPP government, the Indian lot, and that showed what we'd known all along. In fact, you can download, go online, look for inquiry into the cause of death of Walter Rodney, and almost certainly you can download that report, and anybody who's interested can read it. There is no proper case to be made for Forbes Burnham in how he facilitated the Americans to take apart what was in fact a revolutionary government in Guyana, and how he went. Anyway, we can talk about that on another
day. I do want to encourage brothers and sisters though to look up the name Ayusi Kwayana.
Yes.
Because to a significant degree, he was one who was also broke with the Burnham trajectory, but maintaining a strong black Pan-African nationalist, centered trajectory. And in effect was one of the leaders of an African cultural revolution that was also challenging the class dynamics that existed along racial lines in Guyana. Yeah, because that is
absolutely, and he is one. His force was one of the forces that Walter tapped into when he went back there. So an alliance of a considerably intellectually and politically high order was assembled round and by Walter.
Absolutely. And I also want to clarify when I say that Nyerere, sorry, when I say that it wasn't the fact that Nyerere considered Rodney a nuisance why he didn't speak. It's factually true, however, to say that Walter Rodney was critical of Nyerere. He was critical of Nkrumah. Yeah, he was critical of all of them to a degree. There's a speech on online that you can watch on YouTube called "Crisis" or something like that. If you search Walter Rodney "Crisis" or something like that, you'll find a speech that he delivered somewhere in the United States, where he details his critiques of Nyerere and Nkrumah and that generation of leadership.
Importantly, the key thing about Walter is how concrete his criticisms are. So he was in Tanzania he went there from 67 to 60, from 66 to 67, and then went back to the Caribbean, stayed there very briefly because they threw him out of the University of the West Indies, or stopped him going back there. And so he was back in Tanzania from, I think, 68 or 69 to 74. He worked incredibly hard as a historian and political during that period, and developed a critique of what was happening in that terrain, and of the limitations of everything that was being approached. And one of the things he wrote, which might have been a newspaper article, brought forth a stinging response from Nyerere. And Walter had to negotiate his way around that. Having said that, I heard Babu, who was
Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu,
one of the vice presidents of Tanzania, arising from that bringing together of Zanzibar and Tanzania. And I heard Babu say, during that moment when we were organizing in London for the 7th pack, Babu said that Nyerere had offered Rodney the vice presidency of Tanzania.
Wow. I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah. Babu, I heard say that in a meeting, face to face. Now, I don't know if it was true. But
yes.
I heard, that's my source on that one. So Nyerere had very high regard for Walter.
Right.
That was combined with him, Nyerere, having to deal with Walter uttering empirically based analysis of what was happening there, which was excluding the working working class, but manipulating the peasantry, was sending educated young people to the countryside on a false basis, and so on. There's a whole long story about what was involved there,
absolutely,
which we need to properly understand.
Yes. One doesn't have to agree with Walter Rodney's critique, so Nyerere's response, but understanding, the dynamics and the arguments,
absolutely,
right, is extremely important. So give thanks for raising that, Brother Anthony, so that we can get into it. And I want to let Elder Cecil go. So, but you're giving us a lot of time today, Elder Cecil. So we appreciate you. And as I said at the beginning, entirely important conversation that we need to grapple with, with in greater detail. So thank you for laying the groundwork for that, and we look forward to receiving you once again whenever you're ready, with whatever subject you choose.
I'm supposing that we can do something maybe once a month, so we can agree on another topic, and I will come back and be within about a month's time.
No problem, Elder Cecil. The door is open. The door is open. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to close the show as I open with some music from the Ras Messengers, which who at the helm of which was our elder Herokuti, also known as Ras Cosmo Ben Imhotep, who passed away recently. So do stay tuned for that. But we give thanks to all of you who tuned in for this conversation. If you came late, rewind and come again. And even if you heard everything from the beginning, pull up and come again, because I'm sure that there's something that you missed. Yeah, I'm saying that you need to check out again, brothers and sisters. And with that, we say Tenda Mwadi, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kudzai Muzimu Mukulu. We give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation for all African people. We encourage you to join us on the 10th of June for scientific Garveyism. So the subject is scientific Garveyism, a working idealism for the 21st century and beyond. Let us begin by defining what is Garveyism. It's a good question, right? So I'm going to read first. It said, the theory and practice of African people engage in liberatory nation building as exemplified by the life and work of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Brother Leader says it is the sum total of the life and legacy of the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey, encapsulating the man, the vision, and the plan. Yeah? And as you can see here, for the sake of rhyme, I've added the people. Now, initially I had the man, the people, the vision, the plan. For the sake of rhyme, I put the people, the man, the vision, the plan. Yeah? And I'm emphasizing this because oftentimes we focus on Marcus Garvey, the man. And that's good. It's a good start. Yeah? It's impossible, however, to understand Marcus Garvey outside of the context of the people. Yes? From which he came and the people through which he was organizing. Is everybody following me? Yeah. And I'm going to explain this a little bit further. Yeah. Let's go forward as we explain some definitions. Right. Scientific, conducted in the manner of science.
You can enslave us, was done for 300 years, the bodies of men. You can shackle the hands of men. You can shackle the feet of men. You can imprison the bodies of men, but you cannot shackle or imprison the minds of men.
I sparked the blunt before I wrote this, unsure how I approach it. I'm coughing up a lung like I got COVID, gas potent. Snapping on the track like poetry, words spoken. I've been in my feelings trying to find a state to cope in. Justice for...
At the League of Nations, when he cried the plight of his people. He said, until was named after one of my generals, General Tariq Gibran. I traveled Sudan, Libya, Aksum, Bush, Nigeria, Ghana. There I was taken by slave traders. My ankle and my feet. I suffered in silence, longing to be free. I was taken to the slave plantation of the Western world. I worked. My woman taken away. My children sold as a commodity. I traveled the Caribbean islands. I witnessed the slave plantations filled with my people. I traveled Europe, the European continent. Walking in the streets of London, I saw people, strange people. They looked like Africans, like Egyptians, Ethiopians, and yet their name was Smith, James, Brown. Who are they? What manner of people are you? You who come through the vine of the imperial house of Egypt, Ethiopia, who gave civilization to the world. Look at you now. You are being called mothers. You are being called druggists. You are being called all type of names. Lamentation. 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 And then one day, a king of kings was crowned in Africa. At the League of Nations, when he cried out for the plight of his people, he said, until the color of man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, until there are no more second, third-class citizens of any nation, until all man is looked upon as equal as in the eyes of the Almighty God, until the ignoble regime who hold our brothers and sisters in Southern Africa living in subhuman bondage, until the ignoble regime who overthrow the brothers and sisters in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Grenada, Afghanistan, until all these oppressive force is finally and totally abolished and is no more. Until that day, the search for everlasting peace is but a dream, a fantasy, something long searched for, but never, never, never